Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for attending our event today. You're very welcome. Um, my name is Claire O'Reilly. We have over here on the other side Sarah Kavanagh, who is co-chairing with me today. Please bear with us. This is our very first time doing a webinar, so bear with us. We'll do our best. And if the Wi-Fi drops in any which way, I'm hoping Sarah will jump in for me and I'll jump in for her. So um, we'll go with it. We are lucky to have Stream Tech in the background for us, a tech company who are arranging all the fantastic graphics and the screens and arranging the Zoom for you all. So we're in good hands. So that's nice to hear. A little bit gives us a bit of confidence. Before we start, I just might do run through a little bit of background. I'll pass you on to Sarah then, and then we'll get started with the speakers. We have some fantastic speakers lined up today. So just to give you a little bit of background, my name is Claire O'Reilly. I'm a senior social worker and I am chair of SWID. So SWID stands for Social Workers in Disability, and we are a special interest group of the ISAW. So SWID generally meet once a month. We had been meeting in person to explore different topics when it comes to supporting children with disabilities.
So unfortunately, I think Claire's line just went down there. So I'll just take over for a couple of minutes. The joys of Wi-Fi in Ireland at the moment during a global pandemic. But as Claire was saying, oh, she's back, is she? Are you back, Claire? Great.
Sorry, am I back?
Yes.
Sorry about that, everybody. Once I mention the Wi-Fi going down, then it happens. Just to explain, yeah, SWID is a special interest group of the ISAW. So SWID generally meet once a month. We have been meeting in person in Dublin, but unfortunately, due to the restrictions, we've needed to move that to online, which has actually worked out quite well. SWID is a national platform for social workers, which is fantastic. So we've been able to manage to get social workers from all over Ireland join us on the web, which is great to hear from many different people across Ireland as to what's happening on the ground. And we are a special interest group of the ISAW. So the Irish Association of Social Workers was founded in 1971, and to this date there are 1,400 members, which is close to 1 in 3 social workers in Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. And the ISAW supports social workers to improve qualities and standards of social work practice. And they also help to provide us with opportunities to build up our CPD points, among many other things. So we're very grateful for them today. This is going to be a great learning opportunity for us all, and definitely going down for CPD points. So just to mention, along that, we had an annual conference last year also, which took place in Wynn's Hotel in Dublin, which was hugely successful. So we thought we'd do another one this year, but online instead. So the topic for this event came up after many case reviews on how positive outcomes can come about for families and children when we all work together. And also more locally as well, looking at topics that were coming up among our members in the SWID group and among our colleagues as well in the field about positive outcomes that have been established from the interagency work and collaborative work with our colleagues and those in the community around us. So just to quickly note, this topic is very interesting. We had a huge turnout today. We had, in fact, 200 people sign up for the event, to the point that we needed to actually close down the bookings, which is a great turnout. So because so many people are clearly very interested. As I said, we're social workers here today chairing this event, but we'd opened it up to every discipline because the more people who can attend, the better, really. We only had a limited amount of time, so we have managed to source 6 fantastic speakers for the day. We are conscious that there are probably many stakeholders maybe not represented today, but we're only just starting to open up talking about this and doing our bit by bit. So we have 6 great speakers today who I'm sure you'll learn quite a lot from. I'd like to thank all of the speakers because without each of you, today wouldn't have been possible. I know every one of you has given up a lot of time and to share your knowledge and expertise with us, which we're eternally grateful for. And finally, before I go, I'd like to say a big thank you to my colleagues in SWID and in the RCW, particularly looking at the subgroup who were hugely supportive. I was doling out many tasks and delegating a lot of work here and there, but despite that, they were eager to help out. So huge thank you to John and Deirdre, Anna Maria, Karen and Sarah. You've been fantastic. And even thinking about this event, working together as a team is hugely important, and it really helped this event come together. So learning from that, working collaboratively in our communities to help to support families and children can only have better outcomes for them. A huge thank you to the ICW as well, in particular to Cleena, who's in the background, and without her we wouldn't have been able to go ahead with this event. So thank you to you all. I'll pass you on to Sarah now, who's going to do a quick run through of the day, what we're going to cover, and a little outline of the day ahead. I'm sure you'll all get a lot from it. It's sure to be very informative, and welcome, and please enjoy the morning. Thank you all.
Thanks, Claire. Just as Claire said, this is our first online webinar and we're delighted to have everyone here. We have 6 speakers: Niall Muldoon, Catherine O'Leary, Conor Power, Jude Dammerdine, Bernard Gloucester and Caroline Canton. Claire and I then will finish up the day. Each speaker will bring a very different perspective to our topic area. So again, I want to echo what Claire said to thank everyone for being here today. We're very fortunate to have Stream Tech on board to ensuring we run our day very smoothly. And this service was kindly provided by the IASW to ensure that we can deliver this conference to such a large cohort of people. Each speaker will be allocated a time, and within that time, there is a time slot for questions as well. You can ask questions via the chat function, and Karen and Anna Maria will be monitoring this function during the speaker's time slot. Unfortunately, we won't have time to answer all the questions. However, we will hopefully get to as many as we can. I just want to remind you that the conference is being recorded, and therefore just to keep in mind of confidentiality when you are asking questions or providing examples. At the break, we'll have a short survey, so we hope hopefully to obtain your viewpoint. As Claire said, there's so many people from so many different disciplines here, so it's a very quick and easy survey, so just do it on, hopefully you can do it on your break. So lastly, what I'll do is, before I go, is to introduce Niall. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Niall Muldoon, Ireland's second Ombudsman for Children, to our conference today. Niall has kindly agreed to be our keynote speaker. Niall, who is a counselling and clinical psychologist and was previously the Director of Investigations at the Ombudsman for Children's Office. He was appointed by Michael D. Higgins in February 2015, and as Ombudsman, Niall has focused on generating in Ireland where children and young people are actively heard, particularly those who are most vulnerable. So without further delay, I would like you to pass you on to Niall.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire and Sarah. I really appreciate it. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm just trying to get the final bits of the technology sorted so I can get my PowerPoint go. I also want to thank you for online, so I now have to spend 30 minutes trying to make sure my double chin will show. But hopefully it'll be okay. If I could put the PowerPoint up, please, Drew. Yeah, okay. Okay, and again, just 1 second, I just move, sorry, I just have to move my picture away. Okay, thanks, really delighted to be here and a really exciting conference you've all together, and looking forward to spending the morning and learning a lot from it. So without further ado, I'll move on to my own slide. I know we want to get to questions as well, because that's part of the day. Now, I hope. Okay, just a little bit about the office. I'm going to tell you quickly. Some know about the office, some may not. So essentially, we set up under the Act in 2002, Ombudsman Children Act, and Emily Logan was the first Ombudsman in 2004. She started. We're an independent body, and my term of office is signed. My contract is signed by President Higgins. So essentially, what that means, I don't report to anyone. I don't report to a minister. I don't to a Secretary General or department. My accountability is directly to the Oireachtas, so allows for cross-party investigation and interrogation and transparency. I would attend perhaps 3, 4, 5 different rallies. It could be wherever children are engaged, wherever for children to be discussed. So I might go to the Department, the Committee on Children. It could be on health. It could be on housing, education. And again, that's where the transparency and the direct accountability. The senators and the TDs can ask us any questions at that point. And the whole idea is that I have a 6-year term, and within that term, I'm meant to push as hard as I can to improve the rights and promote the rights and protect the rights of children. And I'm not answerable to the government or to any individual minister on that independent task. And it's a crucial part of the mechanisms we have in place for protecting children across the country. So essentially, that's the office. We get approximately between 1,500 and 1,600 complaints a year from all sorts of people, mainly parents, but often a lot of professionals as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Okay, so looking at the system, we talk about systems all the time. We talk about one of the things that I have to do is take investigations and maladministration within systems and where people have followed the procedures and processes and legislation. But essentially, and I've said this many times in many different civil servants and public servants, that the system, any system that's put in place works for 85% of the people that we have involved in that system. So again, if you're living at home, you're married with kids, you have 2 kids, both parents working, your system is who gets up in the morning, who makes the breakfast, who makes the lunches, who drives the kids to school. Things work well four times in the week, and then one day in the week somebody has forgotten something and we have to turn back. Somebody gets sick and one of the parents have to stay at home, and the system has to change and adapt and adjust. And that's a crucial part of what we do. So every system has to be flexible. But if you add into that a system that's catering for and adjusting for children who have a disability, and the amount of differentiation and difference within disability, then that's crucial to have that flexibility in the system. No one child with Down syndrome is the same as the other child with Down syndrome. No child with ASD is the same as another child. So the flexibility is a crucial part of that system. I think it's something we haven't built in the way that I would like it anyway, and I think it leads to a lot of problems. It's something that I think we can certainly enhance and start to build into the future. And I think oftentimes the system fights that flexibility because they feel that its consistency is a part of it. But we can talk about that again later on. Things that I was asked to do today is to do a particular case called Molly, and I'll move on to that now. Essentially, is a complaint that came to us, I think, in 2017. We published it in 2018. Molly is a young girl who was born with disabilities right from birth. At birth, her birth parents were involved, and somewhere around the 3rd or 4th month of her life, she was fostered by a fabulous family who were already fostering another child with disability. She was dependent on her foster carers, and still is, for feeding, toileting, bathing, dressing, and obviously transfer and travel and mobility as well. When we investigated and we looked at the concerns that the foster parent mother came with concerns, and essentially what she came to us with was she was fed up, she was tired. The child was now 14 years of age, fighting for every single step of the way to get what the child needed, nothing extra, nothing special. And the system wasn't helping her and was fighting against her oftentimes. When we investigated that, we found it was right. We found that neither the HSE nor TUSLA saw Molly as a child in care and a child with a disability. The two services looked at their own side of things. So the HSE saw the child as a child with a disability and ignored the fact she was in care, and TUSLA looked at a child and ignored the fact she had a disability. And the two services didn't work in tandem for the child. The lack of coordination there, so that services and supports from both organisations were sufficient, and they were also delayed through arguments for funding. And again, I know I'm speaking to social know what this like, where you know a parent deserves something or should get something, but you spent months upon months fighting for that particular course, or the funding or the refund. and it's wasted energy, and it also drains the goodwill of foster care at many times, and it's something that I think we can fix if there's a will for it. Oftentimes when we take a case, we bring it to investigation, not just for the benefit of the individual child, but we look and see if the system has anything to learn from it and can we impact other children into the future. And when we did that, we asked the question, is there any other children like Molly in the system? It took us about 6 months to push Tusla and HSE to come up with any other numbers, and they said they couldn't come up with them. Eventually, Tusla came up with the figure of 471 children that they knew from 2015 were in the system who were moderate to severe disability in care. HSE agree with those numbers and wouldn't confirm their numbers, but this is the number we felt. So we found through one complaint that there was a huge cohort of children in that circumstance. So likewise, it's a huge cohort of foster parents as well. And so it's an important element of the report that we worked on not just Molly herself, but others. Just there we go. Okay, so again, the system, and this is an important part, and this is something we're very much aware about all the time. The system is not just about rules and regulations and forms and triplicates and going up the line to your line manager and area manager and top of HSE. It's not about that. It's about the individuals within the system. And that's where Ireland really, really shines. We have a lot of really dedicated individuals, social workers, who do above and beyond their call of duty, who do it in trying times and with limited resources. And indeed, to exemplify that, Molly came to us through the insistence of a social worker, and we reported this one day, and then 2 days later we brought the report directly to the Oireachtas Committee on Children. And in that, Sean Sherlock the TD spotted that the social worker, the one who advised the foster mother to make a complaint against 2 state bodies, one of which was their own employer. And again, from my point of view, I think that's the way it should be. It's an emphatic and important part to advocate for children, and you do that system. And we in the Ombudsman for Children are legitimately statutorily set up to be an alternative to court. So if the system isn't working and a parent or a child has to fight the system, and they've made complaints, how the complaints have turned out, they have the right to come to us, and you as social workers have the right to suggest that that's an option. And we do work with many trainee social workers as well, just to inform them about our office, tell them about children's rights, and to also make sure that they know that they have a role as an advocate into the future if they ever need us, and they can see us as a resource. So that Molly's mother pointed in this direction, we were delighted to come forward. And similarly, in the system, the foster carers are part of it. You know, this system is built around the child. It should be built around the child, and the first 2 people who the child need to have support from is the foster and then the social workers that support them. And from my point of view, it's imperative that every effort is made to support all the exceptionally committed foster carers that are looking after children with moderate to severe disability. And you really have to admire and puts their family forward and puts themselves forward to work in this area. It's a job, it's a vocation, it's something that they really love. And again, this family had twice. And we don't make their life easy. And that's a real shadow on our society, that they've stepped forward and are willing to work with these 70-odd children that we're talking about. Don't have an easy ride. The alternative is residential care, and we've come out of that. Ireland put many of our children with disabilities into residential care for many years, and it didn't work. And apart from the economic cost, which is a huge difference, it's probably 5 times more expensive to be in residential than it is in foster care. There's a huge emotional warmth that comes from being part of a family and being loved and looked after on an individual basis. But then you also have to know that the system needs to know how many children are in this circumstance, so that you can plan, you can future budget for it. You can know what the child is going to need. You can anticipate what the child is going to need. And again, I'll talk a bit further on. Okay, so looking at Molly's, and again, it's a crucial part of what we did. The the case was looked originally published in 2018. We did a review after 12 months in 2019, and then January this year we did a 2-year review as well. And there's a couple of positive points. One is that those 470 odd children, are no longer invisible within the system. We now know them. We've called Tusla tell us in 2020 that I believe there's 477 children in that sense. Tusla and HSE together better on that. There's real improvements in that regard. And on an individual basis, Molly is 2 years down the line staying within the family, because when she came to us and when the case came to us, there that she might have to move out of that family. But again, to the credit of HSE, and wrapped around her, they gave her all the support she needed. They facilitated her in anything that was required, and supported both the foster parents and Molly herself. And she's spent another 2 years there, not guaranteed won't move out again. Parents, as ever, parents get older, and it could be difficult. But point of view, there's a real positive example of the two agencies coming together and making a difference in a child's life. It's not all roses. The HSE still haven't committed to how many children are in this category. I can't for the life of me fathom it. They say it's a definition situation in which they don't agree with the definition that Tusla are using. They're very proud of the fact, and again, HSE and Tusla have done a good job in that they're able to tell us now how many children are moving from 17 to 18 years of age, and they're able to plan for that, which is fantastic. However, my rebuttal to that, or my follow-up to that, is that if you can do that for the children who are turning 18, you can do it for the child who was born at 0 and who's has a learning disability. So someone like Molly, from my point of view, the planning should have started on the day she was born, because she's not going to get hugely different. She's not going to grow out of it. She's not going to improve an awful lot, but you can predict a lot of her issues, and you can plan accordingly. You don't have to fight for the resources. Those resources are going to be needed at some stage in their life. Those are things that still need to be needed. The right-hand side there just shows the CHO's areas for HSE where limited progress is made in engaging on these issues. There's still things I think we need to improve on, and we need to really make a difference on that the agencies are able to identify, acknowledge these children, because by not acknowledging them, we're leaving them in an abyss. We're making it harder for you as social workers to deal with it, making it harder for all the social workers involved in both HSE and Tusla to give the best possible service to those children. And it's something I think we really need to move forward on. Okay, when I agreed to this, Sarah or Claire would have sent me on a number of questions, and these are a couple of questions that I hope will be answered as I go through the next part of the discussion and the slides. Again, I'm happy to discuss them a little bit later in the questions if they come up at that stage, but it's crucial that the child-centered practice is what we're all about. Cooperation is the only way to make that happen. What's up there for child-centered practice and collaborative working? Again, I'll show you that some of the successes in HSE and Tusla have made commitments on them as we go into it, but just hopefully this will allow you to see some of those positives as well. And I think it's important to recognize this, as when our job is to change systems and to make systems better into the future for children, we acknowledge that systems don't want to change. They try to maintain themselves and seek equilibrium. So sometimes to change the system, you need to shake it up and disrupt that equilibrium. There's conflict, and that's what our complaints and investigations do, and that's why we use our investigations so they can really have a wider system. I think you need to have fights, you need to have rows, you need to have people who have to reimagine what they've done and acknowledge that maybe it's not working for the people they work for. So Molly's case shows system children with disability, and the state. This is from 1988 or 2018, after we published first an op-ed from Claire Edwards in UCC, and she said the state seems to have built a system which prides itself on impenetrability and inaccessibility. And I can't disagree with that. Again, when you look at the money thing, it just seems, let's make this as difficult as possible for every single resource so that people will stop asking for the resource. And that works if you're going to try, if your sole aim is to try and stay within a budget. But if you're the social worker trying to provide and trying to make sure that the parent isn't going to collapse with a nervous breakdown, that is the worst thing you can possibly do. She also acknowledged that there seems to be a perception that disability is a specialism owned by particular professions in the health and social care arena, and they're the ones who do disability. She went on to also say that she believes that perception comes from Ireland's dual welfare state and the historical development of charitable organisations, which in turn took on responsibility for providing services to children and adults with disability. And we know that throughout our country, you're probably working for many of them, the Section 38 and Section 39 organisations who, at the century, were the ones who really stepped up to help the state provide for the marginalised children, whether it's children with mental health, children in homelessness, children in poor place for the education system. It was the religious and the charitable organisations who stepped. We need to recognise that everybody involved in the system has on responsibility for disability and treat the child as the child. Again, we see a real danger with that is this recent development with St. John of God's, where charities are now looking and saying, listen, we can't continue to maintain this system for you if you don't fund us properly and resource us properly. And that may or may not be the tip of the iceberg. Other organisations are willing and ready to start making that call on the state. So again, this is the system that we're working in, and we've got to change it and make the child at the centre of it. And I have a few examples of that, hopefully. Sorry. Just move. Okay. Last year I put this together, this sort of slide to try and know I think the system works. Anybody who has children will know children don't run in straight lines. Children, they're not homogenous, they're not the same, they don't always stay the same. They start off one way and they go in a different direction. They just, a ball of energy and different. Even my own example, my first child was full of energy, never stopped, couldn't stop running. I spent all my time chasing them, trying to protect them, pulling them back from the edge of the road, playing football all the time, whatever it might have been. Second child came along, we were all set for the same thing, and we ended up with somebody who would keep looking behind us because they were watching the flowers, they were, looking at the sky, and it was a fabulous differentiation. But each child is different, and we have to treat them differently. We can't expect homogeneity. We can't plan for homogeneity. We have to plan for that flexibility and that difference. But unfortunately, these are the way our education and our departments are built. They're built in straight lines, in silos, parallel to each other. And if a child moves in, they can with those children. They work with them in whatever way they can, but they don't recognize them as the core of their system. They have a system within the Department of Health and Department of Children, Department of Education, and that works for them. And the children are the ones who feel it. And that's so wrong. That was my thinking in 2019. And then I thought of it again today as I prepared for this, again, slightly differently. Children hasn't the slightest, but my thinking has changed a wee bit in that I think not even being as parallel and as close together as that. And again, it's something we have to think about and how we can make those children more core. And one final thing, and again, I've been some on the system as such, but I think it's just as the last what I want to put up here to highlight. I think that was an approach cartoon just to put up. Somebody asked us to create a safety net for children, but it wasn't our responsibility to get design. We have a safety. Someone who's still falling through it, that's not our problem. I think that's where we need to start getting past. We need to move from a system that is protecting the system and doing what's at the bare minimum. You can even see it, it's, assessment of needs. We put a report, Jess, and you can see that there's the statutory obligations there, but the bare minimum is being done to fulfill that statutory obligation. And we need to move to this sort of system now. And again, I'm not going to try and rearrange Department of Health and their silos, but if we move to a system that's child-centred, and if every one of the people in there put the child's best interests at the heart of their decision-making, we could change this forever. We could make a huge difference and a huge impact for every child, and indeed for every civil servant and public servant who works child. Instead of having to find how to get through things and manage things and adjust things, you would have a whole different format for what satisfies your system. And I think, again, you're looking at three systems there: education, children, and health. And I put in the Department of Justice as well, because children interact in those ways, and they interact at different times with those different systems. But if the best interest is there, and it's the same Molly, if we take Molly as the centre of that, her schooling is impacted by how her health is. Her foster caring is impacted by how her education is. They're all interacting together, but they're all interacting separately at the moment, instead of putting Molly at the centre of it, and the real health, the real core of their design and their work should be that way. Again, let me just one more time. Yeah. This is another way of thinking about it. They've interacted at the moment. The departments don't necessarily see themselves as crossing over in an awful lot, and they try to limit how they cross over. It's something that they really have built in, facilitated themselves to keep thinking that way and to make it as limited as possible. So let's fight for resources, what and why there's a separation between HSE and TUSLA when a foster care situation with a child with disability. But if we want to improve it, we've got to recognise and indeed embrace the overlap that's there, and acknowledge how much work has been done with each other, and how children are affected by education. Education affects their health. Health, in fact, affects them as foster parents and foster children. And we really need to put the best interest of the child and the voice of the child at the centre of that system. And that'll help them to improve the system. Again, I oftentimes liken this to a restaurant. If I'm running a restaurant and I want to get the best out of that restaurant, I want to keep improving it, I don't go and somebody walks in with, obviously somebody's 21st and they come in with their parents and their family. You don't just ask the parents, how did you get on here? Did you enjoy that? You ask the 21-year-old. And the 21-year-old will be seriously disappointed if you ask their mother how they got on with it. You've got to ask the people at the heart of your work, how is it going for you? What do you want from it? What more do I need? What needs do you have? And this is something we've already legislated. We've committed to the UNCRC, and we've also committed more recently to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So we are really legislated and statutorily obliged to do this, and the government need to do this more. And again, these areas are crucial. CAMS, homelessness, abuse are all still part of that centre. So if you've got Molly or any child in the centre of that, these things are what they're affected by. These are the systems they're interacting with at all times. We've got to make it easier. You've got to ask what the child needs, not what the system can provide for any individual. It's got to be much more adaptable and flexible, and put the child at the centre of it every single time. And there's positives, huge positives. They're now integrating disability, from my point of view, massive step forward, and the children and disability area will be fantastic. There's a €2 billion budget that goes with that, but it's more about the cooperation and collaboration that can happen. The interagency joint protocol, part of the Molly update was that HSE, Paul Reid, the CEO, committed to confirmed his desire to work with Bernard Gloucester to strengthen relationships and work more collaboratively. And that's fantastic. And he's going to do that through the joint protocol. He also committed that community operation teams, chief officers, and heads of social care will work together to ensure, and this is very important, a specific ring-fence proportion of resources is delivered to children in foster care. We're recognising them as a cohort that are crucial and getting the funding that goes with that. Bernard Gloucester, who I'm looking forward to hearing later on, has also committed to working on legislation to mandate multi-agency working. Again, if we need to mandate it, let's do that and make sure that puts the children at the core of the work that's been done. They've established a national HSE and TUSLA group to provide oversight and governance with regards to the joint protocol. So again, the joint protocol begins to live in real life. There's TUSLA area managers will oversight for it, and there's joint workshops between HSE and TUSLA throughout this year. And I know my director of investigations went to speak to one of those joint workshops earlier in the year. So again, it's crucial. And I'm pushing for, at a governmental level, to have shared budgets so that we recognise this child. Again, if Molly had been born and the parents had decided to sue the state, you would come up with an amount of money that it would cost to keep Molly at the best level, and you pay out your number of millions for that. What I'm saying is these children are going into foster care. We owe them the best. We can predict what they need over the next 4 or 5 years, and you need to ring fence a budget, multi-annual budget, puts the best interest of the child forward. And finally, the last piece I want to put in there is just the idea that if we have a best interest clause, and every social worker or any person within the system says, I made this decision on the basis of best interest of this child, and they note it down and say, this is the rationale I had for that. Someone like me who comes to oversight the decision can look at that and say, okay, and I might still disagree with the decision, but we can see where it's coming from. And I think that's the sort of protection that social workers and all civil servants need, is that support to be flexible in individual cases. Fine, I'm going to go past this one quickly. This is just fairly much allowing myself some time for questions. This is my poor construction, but essentially the idea is that we've got HSE and Tusla wrapping around Molly. She's in the centre of that. We've got predicted expenses, so we know what the foster care doesn't have to worry about the next wheelchair cost or the hoist or the changing the car. It's all predicted and it's planned for and it's accepted. It's a much easier thing. That takes the stress off the social worker, who can then spend much more time with the people and individuals rather than fighting and writing forms. It takes the stress off the foster care. And what it does is, personally for the foster care, it says, okay, I don't have to question myself as to whether I'm a good enough parent because I haven't got the resources, which is what we heard from Molly's foster mother. She felt she wasn't doing well by the child because she wasn't getting these things. And it was the system that was stopping her. It wasn't being a good enough parent. And when you've got a care believes and feels and healthy and safe because the system, can you imagine much more they can do, Molly? And that's the way we need in the future. I'm also not naive with this one. You know, this is what I say to my staff all the time, and it's what, as I said, it's what I look for from clients. We can't get perfection. We're never going to get it. The system changes all the time, people change all the time. So it's looking for. I've seen progress here. I'm delighted with the support we got from Bernard Gloucester and from the CEOs are really committed to changing this. And I think we have an opportunity here in the next 12 to 18 months to make a difference in changing the system for the better of the children that are involved. Finally, I just want to say thank you to you and to all the social workers who are involved in this work. It's fantastic work, and I really want to finalise here and go into the questions now, if that's okay. So again, thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Okay, just looking here, I have a question here that it's so important for social workers to feel safe and confident in providing information to parents about the Ombudsman's office. I think there's sometimes a reluctance among social workers to do this if the concerns relate to their own. Again, what we've said to all social workers and all professionals, we're speaking to psychologists and to social workers, social care, guards. Ring our office. It's a free phone number. There's no problem having a conversation. We don't necessarily, what we do is avoid complaints. If we can do it at an early stage, ring us and chat to us. We might point you and post you to somewhere else. And I think it's the safest thing to do. That's proper advocacy. That's proper support for the child and the child at the centre. And we are a legitimate agency to engage. If the complaint has gone to the proper services and the parent is still not happy, then we can come in and do what we can for them. Hopefully that helps. Second question here I have now. When worked across education, disabilities and children in care, I wish there was a greater sharing of skills and understanding across the different sectors so that all of those working with the child become a team around the child rather than teams from different agencies with different agenda and perceived responsibility. You've got, Shell, as far as I'm concerned, you are a team, but you aren't being supported to be that. Molly is the core. Molly is the reason you're all, whether she's in education, whether she's you're an SLT, whether you're foster support, social, you're all working for her. And I think if we can keep reminding ourselves of that individually, it's my job to try and push the system to support you to do that. And I think that's a great way to put it. Education, disability, children in care, we're all working together for the same customer, same client. More importantly, it's a fantastic child or children in that circumstance, and be able to do something positive for them is something I really think we all enjoy. and I think people just need to embrace that, and hopefully they start to embrace that soon and make it easier for you. I'm not sure if there's any other questions there at this stage. Okay, Claire, will I hand you back to Claire or Sarah at this stage? Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. That was fantastic. I'm sure you'll all agree that that was really informative and very, very
Oh, Claire, I
interesting.
think there's
Just
an
to
issue
note, there have been
with
some
your
Wi-Fi difficulties a little bit today, and we are aware of them, and hopefully going forward, things will be a little bit steadier, so bear with us. Also, just before we go into Niall's presentation there, just to note, he has had PowerPoint information there, as you'll see, and some of our speakers who are coming up also do as well. They will be available on the ISAW website next week, so isaw.ie, where you can download them. So don't be worrying about scribbling down notes or anything like that. They will be available next week. And also the event is being recorded, so the link for that will be on the website, hopefully next week also. Just to say a big thank you to Niall. We were so grateful to have him on board today as our keynote speaker. Very interesting, and the Molly reports really are what got us talking about the need to have a conference like this today, to look about the importance of collaboratively working to make change for children. I particularly like some points that he made, in particular, to support social workers to say, yes, ring their office. That's what they're there for, ring, that they don't actively look to investigate, but to point you in the right direction. And that's quite assuring to hear as social workers, I'm sure. And also the flexibility around cases for the best interest clause, to think of the best interests of the child. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. It's testament to the amount of people who are here today. As I said, 200 people have signed up for this event across many different disciplines, because we're all working towards a common goal of supporting children and families and doing the best that we can in order to do that. I'm not sure, Sarah, if there's anything else there that you'd like to add in. No, maybe not. I'm not sure with the Wi-Fi.
Claire, you talking to me? I had some issues with my Wi-Fi there.
Oh, okay. We'll move on. We'll move on to maybe our next speaker.
Yes.
So just to briefly move on to our next speaker then, is Miss Catherine O'Leary. So we're very delighted to have Catherine with us today. Catherine is the mother of 4 adult children, 2 of whom have a disability. So while we had many professionals speaking today about how the system should work, or that we think it works, it's great to hear from a parent in reality of what's happening on the ground, and to hear from her perspective the importance of collaborative work, but also about keeping families informed along the way. Catherine and her husband Tim are dairy farmers in Cork. She's got a degree in facilitating inclusion from UCD, and she was a member of the steering committee who advised the government and produced policy for transforming lives, which underpins really the collective effort nationally to fundamentally reform how we deliver services for people with disabilities. So I welcome Catherine on board now to recount her personal experience of support services and the benefits of clear and timely communication between services and families.
Okay, good morning everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, I have a black screen in front of me, Drew. What's that about? Okay. Well, I'm down here in Cork, and as you know, the way we're working at the moment with all this COVID is all very, very different. And I would dearly love to be in front of you, where I would get a sense of all your faces and so on. But just sure, that's the way we are, and that's the way we find ourselves. The title of our work today, I'm a Child First. And even, we can ignore the collaboratively working to support children. I think that is the key for me. I mean, I am 61 at this point, and I have the 4 adult children, as the introduction said, and so on. And I have dealt with many therapists and consultants over the years. I've dealt with 30 consultants to date, over 5 or 6 teams. And I can tell you the ones that spoke to my child first. And out of 35, there was one. There was one consultant that zoned in on my child, or one therapist, one whatever, zoned in on my child and said, well, how is this little boy today and what's happening and so on. And I think I'm starting with that because I think it is the most important thing. We want to put the child must be first. So whenever you meet a child, you lead with the child. The parent is secondary. And I know that might be difficult to embrace, but I think it's very important. We're trying to manage our clicker here. Can you move those on, Drew? Oh yeah, okay, there you go. Sorry now. So just very briefly, I'm going to go through my personal story just to kind of tell you where I'm coming from. In 1982, Tim and I were married, and in 1985, Julie was born. At 29 weeks, I went into spontaneous labor and she was born. Now, imagine it is 35 years ago, so therefore things were quite different then. But at 18 months, Julie was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. And you would wonder how a mother and a father and grandparents and so on, she was the first grandchild, did not see what was coming, you know. And I look back and I have photographs of Julie as she crossed the floor in our living room with her legs crossed behind her, dragging them. And I did not see that there was something wrong with my child. And again, this is when parents come to you or are referred to you with a child, you know, they can be absolutely blind. And I'm sure you're wondering, how could they not know how severe this disability is or whatever. So anyway, in 98, Julie was diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and sure, it was a whammy. I mean, I was asking, will she walk, and when will she walk, and all this kind of thing. The day she was diagnosed, I was on my own. I had to go home and tell my husband. That was absolutely horrific. So, you know, the level of emotion, I think, that is involved when there is something wrong with your child, I think can get lost in the system, because that never goes away. That feeling of, and unfortunately, oftentimes mothers feel huge guilt. We don't talk about it much, but you will always wonder, what did I do? Where did we go wrong? What happened? You know, and from guilt often comes blame, and very often you're looking for somebody to blame. I quit full-time work. Luckily, farming was very good at that time, and we were able to afford for me to quit work and stay at home with my children. In 1988, 3 years later, my son Diarmuid was born with Down syndrome and a big package of medical difficulties. He was born without his bladder. He had an enlarged kidney, one kidney missing, a hole in his heart. You know, he was a very, very sick little boy. But I think we've always had a very positive attitude. And I remember my husband saying, you know, when he heard all this list of stuff that was wrong with him, I remember the one thing he said was, my son is going to live. You know, so you do positivity as parents, you need to get on with it. Then in 1989, Philip was born, and you would wonder why in the name of God Philip was born in 1989, having already had 2 children with disabilities. And I can tell you, we were all over the place. It didn't even occur to me that I could get pregnant, you know. And this is, I think, the impact of disability on a family parents are not able to think really, and in hindsight, it's absolutely wonderful that we weren't able to think, because when Philip was born, it sort of restored normality to our household, in that we would have been a family that was completely tied up with disability, and here we had this normal child in the middle of it, and then a bit of more carelessness. In 1991, Colin was born, which gave us 4 absolutely wonderful children. Find the clicker. Can you move it, Drew, because it's not going on moving? Yeah, okay. I don't know why it's not working here. So there in front of you, you have my 4 children. Julie on the left, she is whatever she is there, 8 or 9 with cerebral palsy. The newborn Colin, Philip, and then Diarmuid on the right. And so at that time, I had 3 babies in nappies. But, you know, we were extremely happy as a little family. All my children were at home. We were getting on with life, even though it had many, many difficulties. Okay. I'm really sorry about this. It was just not moving for me. Like all people, I think it's important that we remember that children with disabilities have a right to be heard, have a right to be listened to, have a right to be asked, have a right to dignity, a right to privacy and confidentiality, a right to an education, and a right to access health services. I think it's important that we remember the rights that the children have that come to us. They are defined in law by the UN Convention, and I'm sure the people that are listening to this morning, all of you know policy. And our government policy, I believe that the disability policy we have in Ireland at this point is actually excellent. From all the different ones, I'm not going to name them, I think we have excellent policy. Okay, we haven't got them all implemented, but we have actually the blueprint that we need. Okay, next slide. So let's just talk about, oh, you see the word pupils in there, the teacher is coming out in me. Working with pupils with special needs and working with children and families with special needs, it is not easy. You know this, it is not easy. Yet it is exciting, it's challenging, and it's hugely rewarding when you get it right. What level of disability a pupil has, our child has, it does not define what that child will achieve. And I think it's important to dwell on this for a moment, because sometimes you look at the child and you look at the level of disability and you wonder, you know, what is the future for this child, or and what supports does this child need? And I think sometimes we're looking too much into the future. We need to just dwell on what the child needs right now, what the family need in terms of backup, and live in the now, and encourage parents and families to live in the now. And I think this is how we got to where we are as a family. Very soon I learned to live in the now, because if I didn't, I'd be still crying. And this is the important thing. Your other parts of your life must go on. And as therapists and as social workers, you can actually lead parents in that direction and say, you know, continue the rest of your life, make sure you're involved in lots of things and so on. And I know caregiving is difficult and does demand a lot of time, but if the other parts of your life aren't going on, you actually won't cope. But if you look at, I haven't enough time to tell you all about Diarmuid and Julie and my gang, but Diarmuid has gone from strength to strength over the years. He had a huge operation in when he was about 10, which made a bladder for him, and so on. And he went to UCC, even though he has a moderate learning disability. He went to UCC, which was huge for him, and did the contemporary living course there for 3 years. He's a fine young man. He works on the farm. He can milk 100 cows on his own. Now, when I think of that little boy back then, and when he was running away, and when he couldn't be controlled, and when we thought, you know, we'd crack up from trying to look after him and all his illnesses. And now I look at him as a young man who can milk 100 cows, who can go with me in the morning to school, get on the bus if it was normal times, and go to the service provider, Cope Foundation, 2 days a week, go and meet his friends, that sort of stuff. You could never imagine that type of a future for Diarmuid. Likewise, Julie, a young girl who she can walk using sticks, but most of the time she uses her wheelchair, and she's the most wonderful young woman, and she works for Inclusion Ireland. I'm sure many of you have come across her maybe in your work, but Julie she has a degree in psychology. She's an honours degree in psychology. She's a master's in journalism. She drives her own car. A number of years ago, she got married, and she and David have a little baby boy, which is huge joy for us. So, you know, never think that you know what's going to happen in the future, because you don't. Government policy, as you know, is inclusion. And I think, you know, remember that too when you're working with people. We have an inclusive policy. That means you're looking at a child that that child should be able to go to mainstream school, no matter what the disability. That is actually the ethos we have. And in time, maybe that will happen. It has happened in other countries. And so we come to how all this comes about, and that is communication. And we talk about collaborative working, and that cannot happen without communication. It is the oil of all the relationships that go on. So the challenges faced by parents, as social workers and as therapists, when people come to you, unfortunately, it's not just the child is coming to you, as you know, the whole family is coming to you. And very often there's a lot of baggage coming as well. I will always remember my first referral to a social worker, the first mention of a social worker to me. Oh my God, what did that mean? It meant I was a bad parent. And I think it's hard to get away from that. The reason you need a social worker is, you know, you're doing something wrong, and that's quite difficult. So the challenges faced by parents are huge. You have multiple questions, and very often you have nobody to answer these questions. You see your medical consultant, you get maybe a diagnosis if you're lucky, or maybe you don't ever get a diagnosis, but you have all these questions, this why and where, and where's my child going to be, and what education is he going to have, and how are we going to cope, and will he ever work, will he ever have a life, and so on. But always remember that a parent is coming from a place of unconditional love, no matter what the disability is. That love is there, that feeling of wanting to do the best for your child. And you're going then to a therapist who you think will give you this leg up or this, and you think too that maybe getting this thing or this service will make things normal. And that's very difficult, but as you know, that's not going to happen. So you want to know, how will my child function? You're trying to make your child function as best as possible. Can my child go to school? And often these decisions are informed by the logistics of the family as to where they're living, what services they need, and all that. And you have families that may be isolated for all sorts of reasons. You, the professional, often become the confidant, and that's a difficult place to be in, but still, it's a huge part of your work. Okay. Next slide. So what do you do with this trust that you get from families? You have to focus on communication. You have to focus on how you deal with them and how you communicate. And I think the most important thing is honesty. You be as honest as you can be. Always remember, yes, it's the child first. You're always talking to the child, always explaining to the child. recognize that there is a huge partnership. There is a partnership between you and the family. There's also the partnership between all of the agencies that you work with and so on in a different way as well for this family. So you are instigating, collaborating, supporting this partnership that allows this family and this child to progress, because that's what it's all about, this child progressing forward. Never remove hope. Even if you think there's no hope there, never remove the hope, because I can tell you there were so many times in my life that I thought there was no hope. And there was always hope. There was always a silver lining. Understand the limitation of families. And by that, I mean, you may be asking a parent to do X or Y with the child and so on, and it's not happening. And sometimes that's because they're not in the mental space. And I've often heard in staff rooms and so on, oh, so-and-so parent doesn't care. That is never true. That is never true. It is because of something else. Maybe the relationship has broken down. Maybe they're just totally snowed under, and maybe they don't have the money. And I know you are in your work, you're dealing with that all of the time. But sometimes parents find that really, really difficult to admit where they're at. So live the child-centered ethos as much as you can. Okay, next slide. Communication. I believe communication is where, if you think of all the things that happen with regard to services, if you break down all the things that Niall has said, every single thing comes back to communication. How you communicate, how you sustain the communication, and in terms of your records must be right, the people that you need to tell. I mean, the amount of times in my life that you might turn up for an appointment and, oh, sorry, it's at the wrong time, you made a mistake, who made the mistake, all these sorts of things are very, very difficult. Also, in your communication with people, even though a family or a person may drive you crazy, remember, once those words are out of your mouth, you can never take them back. So if you are cross or you say something that you wouldn't normally say, it ruins the relationship. It damages that relationship going forward. So you must always think before you speak. And I'm sure you're saying, oh, sure, we'd always do that, but sometimes we don't as professionals. There have been times, and I haven't time to tell you stories now, but there have been times when I've said something in school to my pupils that I wouldn't say again. So you do learn as you go on. A good professional will develop good strategies, and you'll learn how to deal with parents and how to speak to parents and how to speak to the child. And I think in the rat race that we are in, and you are all immensely busy with huge caseloads, and this is the piece that often gets lost, because you're thinking, I have so-and-so's coming in 5 minutes, and then I have so many more clients and so on, and there's so many I can't get to. So that you have to develop strategies about how you deal with all that. There is no doubt that individual professionals can drive success stories, and you can be one member of the team, but you are the one where the buck stops. So, while you're thinking, oh, I'm going to get somebody else to do that, you should possibly rethink that and say, well, how can I activate it, or how can I do it myself? Because you, the individual, can change the life for that child. An exceptional professional preserves the dignity of each individual he or she works with. Next slide. Be a team player. We go back one. Oh yeah. Be a team player. So encourage children and parents to take one day at a time. Definitely live in the present and take one day at a time. And there is help and support out there. And there is help and support out there from the other people you meet, other parents, and so on. And it's important to point families in the right direction. Always focus on the positive. There's always a positive. And remember that individuals do make a difference. And a disability is not the end of the world, but the beginning of a new world. And if you look at it like that, you will help an awful lot of families. Okay. So we look at this photograph here. I'm just about to finish now, but I'm just going to show you a few photographs. There's Diarmuid, and he's what, 32 now, and there he is reading the lesson at his sister's wedding. This is 4 years ago now, and there's Julie following it. And I love this photograph because it shows how much work has gone into both of them. And you have Julie, and really they've done it themselves. You see Julie there, she's going through the reading. She has coached Diarmuid to read the reading, and he read it word perfect, even though he has Down syndrome and a lot of difficulties with speech. So we'll move again. Next slide. And this slide I want to finish with, because this is the continuation of our family. This is Ricky Helen, who is Julie's son, my only grandchild. I hope I will have more, but this is my only grandchild, Ricky. And they live with us because they need the support for a while, and they will live in their own home eventually. But for now, they live with us. And this little fellow has brightened up our lives so much. It's absolutely unimaginable, the amount of love that's there and the amount of celebration. But if I take you right back then 35 years ago, well, maybe 32 years ago, to when I was in front of a consultant when they were assessing Julie's cerebral palsy and she's spastic diplegia and so on. And he said, do not put too much into this child. Go away and have other children. So, that was a professional, he is deceased, speaking to me. And I know it's a long time ago, but you then look to the legacy, the woman that she has made of herself in spite of her disability, and now this beautiful little boy that will continue their legacy and our legacy. I think that's quite amazing. So some parents will always expect a miracle. And this, I think, for you, this is not your fault. Sometimes the inner turmoil has to come out. You will be bombarded with, whatever. And there probably is nobody in their lives to hear the thing that they're worried about. So you must learn to get beyond that. And please don't blame the system. We know there's an awful lot wrong with the system. And I think when a parent is dealing with you and you're dealing with a child, the last thing you need to hear is that, oh, the resources are this or that or the other, and that's difficult for you too. But it is important to remember when dealing with families. So to bring it all back, we bring it back to the child first. Always deal with the child and speak to the child. And there is huge hope out there. Okay, there are questions. Sometimes it's difficult to assist parents around difficult situations. How have you found in your experience, can professionals navigate positively around these situations? I think they can always navigate around difficult situations. Your biggest asset is to be able to listen, to be really able to listen constructively and try and break down their issues. Sometimes you don't have the answers, but I think just that listening to them and said, well, now, okay, what can we do for today? And today is where you can help your son or your daughter to do X and Y and get on with the therapy. I think that is the only way you can do it. You won't always have the answers, but I think if you feel you're listened to, and even though the answers mightn't be immediate, I think you will be happy. A mother of an autistic boy, thank you so much for your input. I absolutely agree with every word you said about being positive and living in the present. I'm so happy for you and your beautiful family. Well, thank you very much. That's really nice. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you for present. As a social worker and mother and grandmother to children with mild disabilities, I'd be interested to know what supports you feel are required for siblings with no disabilities of children with disabilities. Oh my God. There are serious supports required, I think. And it probably is around groups, you know, their own sibling groups, and I know some of those exist. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. I was going to cough, and you know you can't cough in this climate. I think that siblings with no disabilities do suffer. And I remember one incident when Colin went to school, and he was only a small fellow, he was only about 6, and there was a little boy with Down syndrome in the class. And he came home in the floods of tears. He says, "Mom, you won't believe what happened to me today. The teacher put me sitting with the fella that has Down syndrome, and now I have it in school and at home as well." You know, so I mean, it can be quite difficult. But I think they do need support to get their heads around it. I don't know who should provide that support, but I think if we have an inclusive policy in school, more and more children with disabilities are going to school, and I think probably it's in the education setting that they can be helped. How can parents be shown an open door when they look for services? Oh dear. They just have to be shown an open door. You know, obviously it's about resources. Obviously it's about time and having enough therapists. And obviously we need to take on a lot more therapists to do that. And I am sure it's probably the social worker that has to show this open door. I know it's hugely difficult. I don't know. I haven't got a full answer now for that. I just know that open door has to be there for parents and families. Is that it? That's the last question. Okay. So I hope it's difficult to gauge when you're doing a webinar like this. It's difficult to gauge the response or how if you're saying the right things or whatever, if you're being of any help. I just hope that going forward that this matters, that the child is at the center. I mean, we talk about child-centered, person-centered. The child must be at the center of it. It must be the child first. And I think you therapists, social workers across the board, and all the MDT team, mind the jargon as well. I remember hearing for the first time, we're referring you to the MDT team. Oh dear, what is the MDT team? Oh, you know, the social worker, this, that, and the other. You know, we do tend to use way too much jargon in our work. So just mind that when you're at it. Working collaboratively, it is the only way to go, because that way you have a team, you have a backup, and you're not in your isolated bubble, and your colleague, another colleague, can be of immense help to you. Okay, so bye for now.
Thank you so much, Katrin. That was such a food for thought. And really, I got a lot from that. I think even looking at the slide on communication, honesty, and the children first practice really gave me real food for thought and reflective practice really for me. So thank you so much. I know what I'm going to do, Claire, is just go on to the next speaker, if that's okay. Our next speaker is Conor Power. Conor is a practicing counsellor. He practices in public law, including child law and human rights law, and has lectured on the Trinity Diploma in Child Protection. Mr. Power's talk today will include constitutional rights of children and constitutional and international law in relation to the child. So I'll pass you on to Conor now.
Oh, that's great. Hi, everybody. Conor Power here. I hope you can all hear me. I actually can't hear you, and I'm afraid I couldn't hear Sarah there. Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. Conor Power is my name. I'm here to speak on children's rights. I guess my talk is going to be far more objective, I'm afraid, than the very subjective and personal and excellent speech by Catherine just there. So you'll have to bear with me, I'm afraid, with that. First of all, just to say, when we're discussing the legal rights of children, there is a hierarchy of laws, and as social workers and practitioners, you'll be aware of statutes acting within the Child Care Act 1991, for example. But there is a hierarchy, and at the top of that, there is EU law. It doesn't really impinge on the topic we're talking about today too much, but it is relevant, for example, for child abduction. But it's also, when it speaks of children's rights, it does say something to us about what it means at a broad federal level like that. Of course, our constitution will be the main focus of the talk today. I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. And then statutes, everyday statutes, acts of parliament, acts of the Oireachtas, are what the bread and butter of our law is, be it the Education Act, Special Education Needs Act, be it the Childcare Act 1991. And then one of those also brought in the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, into our law. And Article 8 of that is something you might have all heard of, which deals with the rights of right to family life at home. And that's the European Convention version of our protection of the family, but it's much broader. It protects what we call de facto families, families outside marriage as well. And that's quite interesting. There is in our system, of course, soft law, policies, circulars, and indeed international agreements such as the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that also have an impact on how practice operates. And a lot of our institutions have very good policies and circulars that are guidance for us. They're kind of soft law. They might not be hard binding, but they're kind of presumed to be the position one would adopt unless the law says otherwise, for example. And all of those documents are subject to application in daily practice by social workers, etc. And then when push comes to shove, in the case of dispute, by interpretation by judges in cases in court. And that's how lawyers get to know what the law is, because we can read the EU law, we can read the Constitution, we can read statutes, but actually in practice, it's in cases in court where the detail is really filled in. And of course, each case throws up its own individual subject matter. Just to deal very briefly with EU law, it doesn't really impact on our practice too much, but some of you will have come across child abduction. That's an area now regulated by EU law. EU law is only applicable for certain areas, but where it is, the EU Charter of Rights, it operates at a very fundamental level, so that all institutions of the European Union and indeed all courts of the member states and agencies of the member states that are implementing EU law must operate in conformity with the EU Charter of Rights. And Article 24 of that recognises children's rights in the following way: children shall have the right to such protection and care as is necessary for their well-being. They may express their views freely. Such views shall be taken into consideration on matters which concern them in accordance with their age and maturity. Now, I won't read the rest of it just now, but actually that's a very modern statement right there. That wouldn't always have been in constitutions or, fundamental charters of rights. It's something that really starts in 1992 with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, giving vent to the view that children have rights in and of themselves, and their views must be respected by agencies. So that's a very modern view there. And the EU's Charter of Rights is a very up-to-date document on that. And we'll see that Irish law has also caught up with that in recent times. Our state is established by the Constitution. It's the fundamental legal document of the country. And as such, all laws in Ireland must conform with what the Constitution says, with the exemption of EU law, which operates on a kind of a federal level, and all member states must operate EU law. But other than that, within Ireland, the ultimate determinant of what the law is the Constitution. Now, it's a broadly based document, and it sets out what the Oireachtas is, it sets out what the president is, for example, but it also sets out fundamental rights and the fundamental rights of individuals, including children. And actually, there's been a long recognition by the Irish courts that children are rights bearers. In other words, that children inherently can be the subject of having rights. That's not something, by the way, in history that was always available. It was something that was more modern in its creation. But the Irish Constitution recognises children as having the locus for two rights. One, as individuals, as children, they have personal rights. They have rights pretty much the same as adults can have rights, though we'll say that they're not necessarily the same rights. They also have rights, of course, as family members, as everybody within a family does have. So they enjoy the same, or at least, I pause to say, similar fundamental rights as adults. Most rights in the Irish Constitution you describe as civil and political rights, freedom of association, equality before the law, the right to expression. These are your engagement in public and with public authorities. And most constitutions have a lot of these rights and less of what we might call social and economic rights, a right to housing, or a right to adequate health care. There's one right, of course, that children do have that would be in that category, which is the right to free primary education. That's guaranteed towards every child, and we'll come back to that in just a few moments. But at a fundamental level, then, the Irish Constitution looks at things in more process terms. Most constitutions do. And even where there are economic and social rights, there are very few absolute rights, it has to be said in any case. Question mark nowadays as to whether the child's right to have the child's best interest is a constitutional level, and we've solved that now by the constitutional referendum in 2012. And just to go on to that, you'll all be aware that the Constitution did change in 2012 with the 31st Amendment, sometimes called the Child Rights Amendment. this was caused by the Irish Constitution putting the marital family on a kind of constitutional pedestal. And what I mean by that is under Article 41, the family is recognised as the fundamental unit group of society. But the family that's defined there is not, for example, any old family. It's the family based on married parents. And that actually remains the case. And the knock-on consequence of that was that certain children within those families were deemed to be greater protected by the families than children outside marriage. This had a peculiar effect. Although the rights of the children were the same, this manner in which the state could, for want of a better word, intervene in those families was affected, because the family that was based on marriage were able to put up greater legal barriers to state intervention in terms of childcare, etc., than families not based on marriage, non-marital families, be it single parents or be it families who weren't married. But of course, the problem with that was you're kind of creating a category of persons with certain rights and others without rights. And in reality, the situation of all of them is quite similar. This was kind of a legal issue. It's not a legal issue that's gone away. The distinction remains. But because of the referendum in 2012, from the child's perspective, it really is almost extinguished. The locus, of course, of child welfare remains in the family. And in Irish law, both in the Constitution and in the Childcare Act, the family remains the fundamental unit group of society. But that family remains based on marriage. But we'll see that the rights of the child now go beyond that family. And the counterpoint, the obligation on the state to protect the child's welfare now inheres more clearly in all children, not just those outside marriage, but those inside marriage as well. By which I mean that the legal burdens in intervening in families where appropriate in the child's best interest was lessened. And that was a concern because time and time again, when push came to shove, the Supreme Court would have to say, well, look, there's a constitutional presumption that children are best of their family. And that's absolutely fine, of course, as a matter of principle. But when at the matter of practice, it was intervening or lessening the means by which there could be valued interventions with families, that was causing a problem. So one of the answers was Article 42, capital A of the Constitution that was voted on by the people in 2012. And it says the state recognises and affirms the natural and imprescriptible rights of all children and shall, as far as practicable, by its laws, protect and vindicate those rights. So that's a recognition that every child holds rights. And that was a statement that wasn't in the Constitution as such before that in such a deliberate way. It puts it beyond doubt. It makes it clear what was already implied, that children have those rights and the state recognises it. Now, that must mean something. That must mean that children as rights bearers can look to the state for certain protections. And one of those protections then is in relation to care in general. We'll call it protection from harm rather than in a broader sense for now. And again, the Constitution now regulates when the state can intervene to protect children. And that's in Article 42, capital A, Section 2, paragraph 1, as it's called. And it provides that in exceptional cases, which is already telling us now this is supposed to be the exception because the family is obviously the primary protector of the child, where the parents, and here's the important words for this purpose, regardless of their marital status, and that's the change really, fail in their duty towards their children to such an extent that the safety or welfare of any of their children is likely to be prejudicially affected, the state, as guardian of the common good, shall, by proportionate means, as provided by law, endeavour to supply the place of the parents, but always with due regard for the natural and imprescriptible rights of the child. That's a very careful balancing. It takes wording that was in the Constitution, it expands on it, it broadens out the right of the state to protect children, regardless of the marital status of the parents. In other words, married parents can no longer put that up as a roadblock, potentially, to the state intervening in the marital family, always with due regard for the natural rights of the child. So what does that mean in effect? Well, it means in effect that childcare interventions, where they are proportionate and lawful, carried out in accordance with the Childcare Act, are undoubtedly constitutional. And it just took away any doubt that there might be about the lawfulness of state action. And the state, of course, as an entity, can only act in accordance with the law. There's a really important principle, not just of democracy, but of what's called the rule of law. The state must abide by the rules. Also, that amendment said that provision shall be made by law that in the resolution of, and I put there just specified children's cases such as custody, access, etc., childcare, the best interests of the child shall be the paramount consideration. It puts a very child-focused centre in the Constitution and saying that when issues are for decision by a court, when push comes to shove, the paramount consideration is that of the welfare of the child. Now, it's not the only consideration, but the paramount means the first and most important in effect. It's the one that should determine the outcome, though it's not the only consideration. Also, more protection for the ascertained, for the views of the child in such cases, having regard to the child's age and maturity. Again, a recognition that as children get older, their views of their own welfare should be determinative where that's appropriate, and must in any case feed in. It does, of course, remain a fundamental tenet of our constitutional law and indeed of our statute law, I'll come on to that in just a minute, that the best interests of children are secured within the family. And now that's kind of regardless of marital status, I would have thought. The state can only intervene to secure the best interests of the child where there is a failure by the parents. Now, that failure, by the way, isn't necessarily pejorative. What I mean by that is a failure can be either abuse, which is obviously pejorative, or it can be neglect. So it's a failure in terms of looking after the children. It's a failure to protect the children. It's a failure to provide for the children. That's the constitutional test. And we're not looking necessarily for blame or fault all the time. That's an important consideration. But the state, as I said a few moments ago, must act by law. And that means there has to come a tipping point. I mean, the difficulty with law sometimes is that it gets adversarial. Once you go to law, you're fighting. People lawyer up. It's not exactly a mediation. It's not necessarily collaborative. And so the danger of going to law is you get lawyers and you get law, and it can be a very tough adversarial place. It's the objectivity, as I mentioned at the outset. So there has to be a rule as to what determines. And in general terms, unless the state has the power of compulsion, the parents determine. Parents rear children in our constitutional regime and our statutory regime, not the state. No, it sounds very kind of, anti-communist or whatever else. But what I mean by that is the rules in the Constitution must mean something. And so our rules say that parents are the people who rear children and who make the decisions for children, unless somehow that doesn't match a standard which is detrimental to the children's health. And then if it's appropriate and proportionate, the state can intervene. So a good example of that a few years ago was the PKU test case, which I think many of you would be familiar with, the PKU test carried out at birth for various diseases. And a couple of parents in 2001 said, well, look, we don't believe in that test. We don't want to do it. And the then Northwestern Health Board went to the courts to get a declaration that they could, in fact, force the parents to carry out that test. And they lost. The Supreme Court said, well, look, this isn't set down in national legislation. This isn't something that parents have to do as a matter of law. This is advisory. And as long as it remains, at least as long as it remains advisory like that, the parents decide. Even if the doctors think it's for the best interests of the children, that doesn't necessarily prevail in every case. You don't have rule by doctors, we have rule by parents. That means something. Now, and examples, for example, were given by the judges. Said, look, parents take risks all the time. They allow children to cycle to school. There's an inherent risk in that. So what they're saying, they weren't being flippant, by the way, in saying that. What they were doing is risk assessment. That's just because there's disagreement doesn't mean that parents' views doesn't count. So that's in effect what the courts are saying. There's kind of a dialogue. There has to be a risk assessment dialogue, and of course a tipping point. If parents are being reckless, or if their decision isn't really child-centered, or if there are other nefarious motivations behind it that in fact would be detrimental to the child's welfare, then I think obviously the state could possibly intervene. Also important in that case was the fact that there was no legislation for it. So the courts are saying as well that if Parliament determined that there had to be this test carried out, that might carry greater weight. Whether Parliament could mandate for everybody without a conscientious objection or something like that is a different issue. But in any case, that remains to be seen. Possibly in the context of mandatory vaccinations, that have been issues that have to be addressed, and that's been debated in recent years. But ultimately, as I said, parents rule, but the state can intervene if there's a failure on their part to protect their children. So it's a balancing act. There has to be dialogue as between the two. And the courts, as I said, have always recognised what children's rights are and that children's rights exist. And you see this back in even 1980. It seems like a lifetime ago now. But in a case called G versus An Bord Uachtaile, the adoption board as it was at the time, the child has the right to be fed and to live, to be reared and educated, to have the opportunity of working and realising his or her full personality and dignity as a human being. These rights of the child and others must equally be protected and vindicated by the state. In exceptional cases, the state is given the duty to intervene. And you'll see that's not too much different than the law is now. The law we now have under the Constitutional Amendment is an adaptation of that and modernisation of that. So the protection of children there often, of course, in this context is from the parents, unfortunately, or from parental neglect. And the state is obliged to protect children's welfare, and the state is obliged to intervene when parents fail. And the primary means by which that's done is the Child Care Act, which creates an obligation in Section 3, a general obligation on the Child and Family Agency to intervene to protect children, and also a statutory presumption that recognises the constitutional position that children are best protected within the family. And you see that in the terms of Section 3. It's a function of the Child and Family Agency to promote the welfare of children who are not receiving adequate care and protection. And Section 16 creates a more specific duty to intervene where children are not getting that. But in doing so, the law says that the CFA must identify children who are not receiving adequate care and protection, and then, having regard to the rights and duties of parents under the Constitution, regard the welfare of the child as the first and paramount consideration, and insofar as practical, give due consideration to the child's view, the wishes of the child. Again, that's quite a good encapsulation of what the balancing rights are: the interests of the child, the interests of the parents, the wishes of the child, and the role of the state. So they're the various interests that have to be balanced in doing that. And there's a statutory presumption there at section 3.1c, have regard to the principle that in general it's the best interest of the child to be brought up in his or her own family. So that's a high threshold for removing children, by the way, and for intervening. And one could say that in so doing, and with that general principle that children are best in their families, that's an obligation to cooperate as well. And you can see that in a recent case, G versus the Child and Family Agency, which is kind of disproportionate impact. So the greater the intrusion is, the ultimate intrusion, of course, being a childcare order under Section 18, taking children into care, the more it has to be justified. But there can be lesser interventions, a supervision order or advisory, or just getting in there for viewing to see what's going on. And so they could happen maybe in broader circumstances, and that's proportionality. It's a spectrum of what you can do in your practice protecting children, depending on the need. And the Supreme Court in 2018 said the greater the restrictions on access, in that case by parents and members of the family, the greater justification there must be if the underlying aims are to be achieved and if violations of rights under the Constitution are to be avoided. And you'll see there the Supreme Court there cited Eriksson in Sweden, where the European Court of Human Rights noted that paragraph that the mutual enjoyment by parents and children of each other's company constitutes a fundamental element of family life. So interfering with that is something the state has to justify, and the greater the interference, the greater the justification must be. In other words, the greater the risk to the child. So that's a gradation. And you see that at one end of the spectrum, obviously, the terrible cases you've all come across, where children have to be removed. And the spectrum comes back from that to cases where it's really more providing assistance to family. And pretty anything up to the bad cases is probably a collaborative approach, is probably what the Constitution and what the statute law would have in mind. There are, of course, issues in the Constitution of the economic and social rights, that's services to children in terms of their protection. And the greatest one of those, of course, is education under Article 42. Even that recognises that family is the natural and primary educator of the child. But the state is mandated to provide a certain minimum, and parents must provide a certain minimum, and the state is obliged to provide for free primary education. The word "for" there in recent times coming in for a lot of commentary. It's the device that says that, well, the state shall provide for it, but not necessarily provide it. In other words, if it's been provided, that's okay by private means, then the state doesn't have to. But the state, in fact, does, of course, subvent all education in the state, both public and private, and you'll see that because, in fact, in the Constitution, they're mandated to do so. The education under consideration here is defined in broad terms. It's different to nurture. It isn't that, but it is education, and it's not just scholastic. It's like what happens in schools, but it's not just that. It is, of course, the promotion of the child's inherent skills and the child's inherent capabilities such that they can grow to become an adult. But it's not limited to that, of course, because the state is also obliged to educate children with learning difficulties. And you'll see that in the case of Donoghue, the Minister for Health, 1996. And even in that case, the High Court felt that there was a need for continuous learning to ask the effect of holidays. And of course, at the moment, if there's a need for continuous learning in the context of a child with special difficulties, one might wonder what the effect of a prolonged COVID cessation of schooling might be. I only posed the question. I don't know yet. Obviously, COVID is something totally different to holidays, and obviously the threat to welfare by going to school potentially would outweigh the right to education. But it's a very delicate balance right there, not necessarily straightforward. But there are dicta from the courts to say that everything has to be proportionate there. We know from Sinnott and the Minister for Education that the right to education ceases at age 18. But that's a kind of a blanket approach taken. sorry. I want to deal very briefly, if I can, with Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. This kind of dovetails with our Constitution. It's handy for families not based on marriage because it protects relationships not based on marriage, and children born outside marriage, as it might have been back in the day. There's a positive obligation to protect family rights here as well. This inheres in care cases. And you saw the Supreme Court in the recent case that I just mentioned a moment ago, referring to Ericsson in Sweden, one of the first European Court of Human Rights cases on care. And that was about access and ensuring access to children. Why was that? Well, the European Court has always been focused on this issue of having no drift in care. And the European Court, this comes from proportionality. All very good that the state can take children from parents where that's justified, but they have to come up with the aim of it. What is the aim? If the aim is parental unity, then you must keep access, and access is very important for the right of the child and also for parents if the aim is reunification. So this is about no drift in care, not making a decision about what's going to happen, what the placement outcome should be. And ultimately, of course, in Irish law, we see that's for social workers, but ultimately for the court in Irish law, and the court under Section 47 of the Child Care Act can always make directions in that. But so, for example, in recent 2006, the European Court said, well, you can't take children to care just because the parents are having marital difficulties. You've got to assess that. And that's a collaborative approach right there. But that's what the court is saying. You can't, the grounds alone of parents having difficulties isn't sufficient. And in one case, happening in Ukraine in 2008, parental blindness. The parents were both blind. And in that case, the court said, well, that in itself is not a basis for taking children into care. The state has to necessitate, in that case, Ukraine has to investigate the need for investigation, need for supports to see if the parents can nevertheless provide support. I do want to mention one case, if I may, and I'm sorry, I think I've just gone slightly over time. Laban and Norway, 2019. This is a fairly recent, fairly big case from the European Court of Human Rights. It's what we call a Grand Chamber case. And here was the authority's decision to remove the mother's parental authority and allowing the children's foster parents to adopt them. And that was found to violate Article 8 on the limited evidence, because there simply wasn't enough evidence, they said, to justify this decision. It was kind of presumed that the mother who had the child outside marriage and had placed the child in foster care had kind of ceded her rights. And they said a few statements that they're kind of recalibrating. And I should say there's another case before the Grand Chamber called Ibrahim in Norway that will be for decision sometime later this year, early next year, that is of the same vein. So the European Court is kind of ramping itself up from this Laban decision of last year. It says a care order should be regarded as a temporary measure to be discontinued as soon as circumstances permit, and that any measures implementing temporary care should be consistent with the ultimate aim of reuniting the natural parents and the child. Very interesting statement there. They really are ramping that up. A positive duty, they mentioned, on states to take measures to facilitate family reunification as soon as reasonably feasible, subject to its being balanced against the duty to consider the best interest of the child. In other words, ordinarily, the aim must be reunification of the family, unless that's not in the child's best interests. Sorry, I thought I had one remaining slide. In any case, I'll finish up there, and I see the questions are coming in. I'm sorry about that. So the first question was when. Thanks for there are two questions, Bernie. Thanks very much, and I'm sorry for going over time. Drew, could you flash that question? Sorry, question one. When looking at a collaborative or interagency working, how do we ensure that all agencies take their responsibility, not just TUSLA? Well, that's a good question. Well, all agencies, depending on the agencies in question, I'm going to assume they're statutory agencies. How do you ensure it? Well, agencies, our state agencies, must operate in the rule of law. They have a remit. They have a public duty. They must carry that out. Now, they might say in individual cases that they have a broad public duty. Individual cases they might say that's dependent on various factors. Ultimately, how do you ensure it? Well, you go to lawyers, you get a legal answer, I'm afraid, and the answer is mandamus in the High Court, an order directing them to carry out their functions. But the problem is we come back to this kind of no absolute rights. So if it's an agency that's to provide services, for example, well, there's no absolute right to a defined service. So, for example, in some cases, for autistic children in the past, parents were seeking specific remedy, a specific school or specific type of education. And the courts were saying, well, look, you were offered this over here, and that actually matches your need. So once your needs are matched, you don't have the choice thereafter as such. It's not, the parental choice isn't there. But if there's a basic failure of service provision, then the answer would have to be mandamus in the courts. The soft power then of reminding agencies that they have a role to play is the important one. I hope that's not too vague an answer, and I'm sorry if it was. And then question number 2 is, what's the legal situation where a parent states that they can no longer care for their child with ASD or moderate intellectual disability and refuse to take the child from school? Tussler refused to get involved, stating it's a disability issue, and the HSE voluntary agency provide crisis placement and residential placement, and the parent does not engage with services and is not actively involved in the child's life, which makes decisions for the child and monitors that there's an actual case. Well, I don't really like commenting on actual cases. I'm not being smart about that. It's also a very long question, I'm afraid. Parents, I mean, look, you have to take it in stages. I mean, first of all, the child obviously has needs here, but it's not with ASD and moderate intellectual disability. It wouldn't be a need that would justify a care order as such, but it might justify a supervision order, and that might at least force engagement with the parents. I mean, the parents are to engage, but they refuse to take the child from school and just don't get involved. Okay, it's a bit I'm really sorry. I'm not going to be able to give a helpful answer to that, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of dodging that question. Who makes decisions for the child and monitors their welfare? Well, ultimately, that's your collaborative approach, primarily as parents. But if parents aren't looking after their children, then there should be a referral to TUSLA, and that has to be the short answer, I'm afraid. Thanks very much. It's a short kind of presentation of what constitutional rights are. I hope it was focused enough for your needs, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a million for that, Connor. That was really helpful. I know what you mean about going after Catherine. Catherine's talk was somewhat different to the other speakers today, as it's hugely emotive and very heartwarming. But that's the beauty of the mix of speakers that we have today, hearing from a parent and then hearing from the different sides. The legal perspective is just as important and really important for us as therapists and families on board today to hear the legal side. Just remind everyone, the slides will be available on the RSAW website next week, because there's some really important bits and pieces there in Connor's slides. So thank you for that really, really important information. We've run over time slightly, so we're going to take a quick break, and if we can ask to come back for 11:25. Before you go, just to mention, we've got 3 fantastic speakers to come after the break. And if you have, it should only take maybe a minute during the break, we're going to run an online poll with simply 3 or 4 questions. It's just an opportunity to hear from you all on who you are and what life is like for you working on the ground. We're hearing a lot from the speakers, but we're conscious that we have a lot of people on board today with a wealth of knowledge and experience. So if you wouldn't mind just taking, should only take maybe a minute to answer those few questions and get a well-deserved cup of tea, and we'll come back at about 11:25. Thanks a million.
Hi, myself and Claire want to welcome everyone back to our conference. And we've had a really, really fantastic morning. It's been really, really food for thought for me anyway. I don't know about you, Claire, but what I would like to say is thanks for everyone doing the poll. And we will have those results at the end, just towards the end, we'll kind of come up back to about the results there. Our next speaker is Dr. Jude Damadane. She is a consultant with the Child and a consultant with CAMS in Lindadara in Kildare, Wicklow. She has over 10 years experience as a consultant, and she's worked in Beach Park Services and in Tala in the past. She's provided psychiatric care to children with neurodevelopmental disorders and complex genetic syndromes. So I will pass you over to her now.
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so how many of you have asked children and young people to talk about their mental health problems and get help early if they're not feeling the best? I'm sure a number of you have done that. What if those children are non-verbal? What if those children don't understand what they're feeling? What if they can't explain? That is children with intellectual disability are facing on a day-to-day basis. Today, I'm going to touch upon mental health problems in intellectual disability and give you an introduction to CAMS ID services. So I'll go through the basics of intellectual disability just to set the scene and talk about mental health problems and the policy context and CAMS ID service, and I'll touch upon the referral process to CAMS. So some basic definitions. The WHO defines intellectual disability as the significant reduced ability to understand new or complex information and to learn and apply new skills. This means the brain's ability to receive, process, analyze, and store information is impaired in ID. Global developmental delay is the terminology used under 5 years of age when the severity cannot be determined. There is the WHO classification of intellectual disability, which is based on IQ score, which is obtained by standardized testing, as many of you would know. Mild ID is with an IQ score between 50 and 70. Moderate ID is IQ score between 35 and 50. Severe ID 20 to 5, and profound ID is under 20. In the new DSM-5 and ICD-11, ICD-11 hasn't been published yet for wider use. The terminology is going to change. We are going to be talking about intellectual developmental disorders, and it is defined by 3 core criteria. Low intellectual ability, usually defined as an IQ of less than 70, significant impairment of social and adaptive functioning, and onset in childhood. The severity of deficit in terms of adaptive functioning is usually determined by various tests which psychologists and other clinicians undertake, and it has to be addressed on 3 domains: social, practical, and conceptual domains. Practical domains would be activities of daily living. Social domains would be social communication difficulties, peer relationships, friendships, etc. And conceptual domains will be around the areas of memory, intelligence, processing speed, etc. So a little bit about the causes of ID. Often, in nearly 75% of cases, the cause of ID is unknown. It could be environmental factors, it could be genetic factors, but ID often runs in families. Of the known causes, Fragile X syndrome is the most common inherited cause of learning difficulties, and trisomy 21 or Down syndrome is the most common cause. Other causes include behavioral phenotypes with genetic or chromosomal etiology. This would be your Angelman syndrome, Cornelia de Lange syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome, etc. The other known causes may include anomalies in the developing brain due to illness or injury. For example, meningitis in early childhood or infancy. fetal exposure to drugs or alcohol, oxygen deprivation during birth, premature labor, head injury, malnutrition, and toxic exposure, example lead. It is said that low birth weight is the single best predictor of learning difficulties, whether it is generic learning difficulty or specific learning difficulty. So let's talk about some figures here. It is well recognized that children with intellectual disability have a higher incidence of mental health problems. Unfortunately, we don't have any Irish studies to give us figures. In 2007, in the United Kingdom, Emerson found that prevalence of psychiatric disorders was 36% among children with ID, when you compare it to 8% among children without ID. Children with ID also accounted for about 14% of all children with a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Increased prevalence was marked for ASD or autism spectrum disorder, hyperkinesia, and conduct disorders. And I presume this is very likely to be replicated in the Irish population. In the Irish census of 2016, over 66,000 people, which represents about 1.4% of the population, was described as having an intellectual disability. The figures from the IDD register, the national register, would be slightly different. I think it is a conservative figure, as it can be up to 5% in some studies. Out of this, 24,000 people were under the age of 19. So roughly about 30 to 40% of people with ID are children and young people. So mental health problems in ID. There are many underlying factors that may contribute to the development of mental health problems for children with ID. This includes severity of their ID. The more the nature of severe the ID is, the more likely they develop mental health problems. The cause of their intellectual disabilities. For example, behavioral phenotypes present with behavioral difficulties and mental health problems within themselves. Then there are other biological factors such as pain, physical ill health, polypharmacy. Polypharmacy means often children with ID have received treatment with epilepsy, anti-epileptic drugs, and that can lead to mental health problems and behavioral problems. Psychological factors such as abuse and neglect, social factors, poverty, life events, poverty of social environment, stigma, all of these, including developmental factors such as affect dysregulation and attentional control, may lead to mental health problems. Children with ID also experience trauma. There is a high rate of abuse and neglect, bullying, family stress often leading to family violence, abandonment and isolation, institutionalization, etc. in children with ID. When we are faced with a problem in ID, when the child presents with difficulties, we often ask, what is wrong with you, rather than what is happening to you. How what is happening is affecting you. It is important to remember that they can be traumatized. They also want to feel safe, strive for meaningful relationships, and feel empowered, even though they may not have the words. Behaviors that challenge, for example, aggressive behavior directed at either their parents or siblings or peers, and self-injurious behaviors often causes a huge amount of upset in the people around them, and this calls for immediate intervention. And then the focus becomes the behavior rather than looking at what is actually happening. We should be looking at other factors in this case, looking at environmental factors, what has changed in their environment. Whether it is a manifestation of epilepsy or some drugs there, some medication they are taking, or is there an underlying physical cause? Some of the challenges in identifying mental health problems, often they are undetected and symptoms can be lost among the plethora of behaviors. They are often comorbid with epilepsy, other physical health problems, sensory impairments, And it is important to consider these problems in both the diagnosis and management. Children with ID may be unable to complain of, like I said in the beginning, or describe their symptoms or distress, and their symptoms may be inadvertently attributed to their learning disability. They may have unusual presentations of symptoms the more severe the nature of their ID. And diagnostic delay leads to problems over time, and that can influence outcome. For example, trauma leads to increased cortisol levels in the brain, which is a stress hormone, and that in itself can lead to a lot of difficulties in the child, both physical and mental health wise. Management of mental health problems. The most common intervention used to manage mental health problems in children or people with ID is psychotropic medication. We don't have much child data. These are based on adults data, even though medication has very little effectiveness. The safety of medication is not well tested in this group because often these children and adults are excluded from clinical trials, and they are very sensitive to medications and their side effects. That is due to the nature of their neurodisability and the neuronal susceptibility to the various side effects. Having said all of that, about 50% of adults with intellectual disability are prescribed psychotropic medication. 20 to 25% receive antipsychotics with a lot of side effects, and 12% are on antidepressants. A large proportion receive mood stabilizing drugs for the treatment of their epilepsy. Around 16 to 50% exhibit aggression or challenging behavior, and up to a third of these cohort are prescribed psychotropic medication. It's more commonly prescribed in young males with severe cognitive impairment. The next most commonly used is psychosocial intervention. However, the therapies are not standardized in this group, and they have to be tailored, and there is limited expertise in the delivery of psychosocial intervention, even though it is very important to consider this alongside medication or even before medication. The Irish mental health policy, as you all know, outlined in the Vision for Change, emphasises the importance of MDT, multidisciplinary teams, in delivering mental health services to the whole population, including children with ID. And you can see the breakdown of the teams, and they have also recommended the development of acute beds and day hospital services for mental health and intellectual disability treatment. We have moved on from Vision for Change. Now we have published Sharing the Vision document. Where are we now in terms of service provision? A phased resource plan is in place to develop at least baseline teams involving a consultant psychiatrist, clinical nurse specialist, psychologist, and admin support where there is no existing team, and to augment the existing teams where they are present. And there is also talk about innovative services which might include therapeutic respite for children with ID and significant mental health and behavior support needs. That would, I'm cognizant of the question that came earlier. In that scenario, that child might have benefited from therapeutic respite if it was available to that family, and the parents would have been able to care for the child at home going forward. There are 15 teams required as per Vision for Change, 1 per 300,000 population. There are a small number of professionals, mainly psychiatrists, working at CHO level. However, there are also areas with no dedicated service for children with intellectual disability. In CHO 7, which is Kildare, Beswicklow and Dublin, we have one team with 2.6 whole-time equivalents based in Cherry Orchard campus, and one team with 1.4 whole-time equivalents based in Kildare town, covering Kildare, Beswicklow. So that is it. And the national coverage for Vision for Change for CAMS ID is currently running at 14%. CAMS ID team, as you know, it's like a generic CAMS team. It's a specialist mental health team, which aims to complement the services provided by primary care and disability network teams for limited periods of time. It's recovery oriented, and the plan is always to discharge back to primary care or disability network. And teams, and children should continue to access the supports through their disability network team, because the CAMS ID teams are not staffed to provide all the things they need like SLT, OT, etc. Specifically, the team provides diagnosis and treatment of mental illness, moderate to severe, which significantly impacts on the day-to-day functioning of the child. And the CAMS ID team do not have access to educational into other education, special education, or respite or residential services. We do have an advocacy role. Progress in Disabilities for Children and Young People. It's a national program, and under that there are Children's Disability Network teams. In Kildare, we are way ahead in terms of the network disability teams. There are in fact 3 teams in the county, and the aim of this is to provide equitable and consistent services for all children with disabilities. And it would be best practice for intervention to be provided initially by the network disability team prior to referral to CAMS ID team. Referral criteria. Referrals are considered when there is an evidence or suspicion of moderate to severe mental illness or disorder before the age of 18, living in the catchment area with level of ID in the moderate to severe to profound range. Children within the mild ID range falls within the remit of CAMS service. In order to understand the level of ID, all referrals should include a comprehensive cognitive and adaptive behavior assessment completed by a psychologist with experience in neurodevelopmental disabilities, preferably in the previous 3 years. We are not going to turn down referrals of a 15-year-old who had a psychological assessment at the age of 10 or 9, for example. All referrals should be accompanied by a GP or a pediatrician referral, because medical complications, medical issues can present as behaviors and mental illness in children with ID. They may also affect our treatment choices. It is important for us to get that medical referral in. And sometimes simple things as dental pain may cause mental behavioral challenges for children. Sometimes referrals are not accepted if the primary presentation is just autism or ID. And also sometimes we look at intervention provided by the disability team. If there has been no intervention, we would direct them back to the network disability team. And the pathway, I said, is through GPs. And if another professional, for example, wants to make a referral, they need to get involved, their GP involved. A completed referral form and a referral letter from the GP is sought at the time of referral. If not already furnished a psychological assessment, we'd look for that and other reports, for example, positive behavior support plan. When a referral is not accepted, it will be the referral agent will be advised in writing, giving clear justification and signposting to appropriate services. Let me finish by this quote. You treat a disease, you win, you lose. You treat a person, I guarantee you, you will, no matter what the outcome. It's a quote by Patch Adams. I think it is very poignant in children with ID and mental health difficulties. It opens our thinking to holistic approach and the importance of psychosocial interventions along with medication in children with ID and mental health. I have some references here, and I'd be open to questions. So it has been increasingly difficult to have genetic testing carried out for ID and mental health issues within public pediatric services. Would you advise? Okay, genetic testing is done usually through Crumlin Hospital. So if you can contact the child general practitioner to send a referral to the GP, through the GP to the genetic in Crumlin. It is, I can't get the name of the consultant there, but it is the genetic services in Crumlin. And in my experience, it is done maybe through the GP or the pediatrician. I hope that answers the question. Okay. Last you mentioned toxic exposure. Is there a link between tap water and regimen? study has been undertaken. Yes, lead exposure, especially, I don't think in the new building regulations people use lead in pipes anymore. But in olden days, in the 50s and 60s, I think a lot of the pipes were made of lead and there was toxic exposure. And there are studies worldwide proving lead exposure and anemia and mental health difficulties and intellectual disabilities. Yes, yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Judith. Really interested to get the mental health perspective. As we're all aware, mental health is hugely important and on our minds a lot these days. So great to have that information there from CAMS today. We'll press on because we're running a little bit behind just by a few minutes. So our next speaker is Mr. Bernard Gloucester, who is the CEO of TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency. He's former chief officer for HSE Midwest, and he has 30 years experience as a social care practitioner and social health service manager. So I'm sure we're all eager to hear from Bernard. So I'll pass you on now. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire and Sarah, and thanks for hosting this morning. And hello to everybody on the call. What strange times we find ourselves in adapting to coming together in this way. Just perhaps 9 months ago, the choice of technology and webinar was perhaps a convenient choice, and we could take it or leave it, and we could mix it with coming together. But now it is thankfully available to us because it is the only choice for now as we deal with the global pandemic and all that that will bring. Very conscious today that as you talk about one child, that the impact indeed of the unintended consequences of responding to the pandemic has presented many challenges for children, and for children universally, not just those in the child protection system and not just those in the disability system, but universally. And I think it's important that when we talk about one child and we talk about our messaging to them, that we keep that in focus too. I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to talk to you as the CEO of the Child and Family Agency, and as Claire said, I've been in that position for the last year. Before that, I was a chief officer managing all of the non-acute hospital services of the HSE in the Midwest, and that of course included disability services, mental health services, services for older people, social inclusion services, and so on. And so I come from many different perspectives and many different organisational perspectives of the types of challenges that you've chosen as a subject matter to talk about today. And you deserve great recognition for doing that, and I think particularly in the context of talking about children who require, need and use other services, and also who are part of or the focus of attention of the disability services. And in that context, you are talking about integrated working. The speakers this morning, I think, have given you a lot of different flavour of the types of issues and approaches to a whole range of challenges that we are presented with as public service providers when it comes to providing services to children. The Ombudsman and his seminal work, not just in the publication of the report that has become known as the Molly case, but indeed his follow-up of that. And one of the first things that arrived on my desk when I arrived into the Child and Family Agency as CEO was a request for an update as to what the agency had or had not done, as the case was, in relation to implementing the recommendations of the Molly report. And I looked at it and thought to myself, I remember doing that in the HSE, so that perhaps crystallised for me my experiential understanding of the range of issues and challenges that can be presented. Nobody could be, I think, but blown away this morning by the presentation by Catherine and her experience in relation to um, her life as a parent and their life as a family, and the stories of Dermot and Julie. And I think the point about hope was particularly important. Point. I think it has a significance beyond the hope of a parent. I think all of us as people who aspire to provide or lead or manage or deliver professional services, regardless of our role within those, if with the evidence and with the practice and with the skill set we don't articulate, show and demonstrate a sense of hope for the future, for people who find themselves in vulnerable situations, well, what hope do they have if we're not part of sharing that journey and creating that hope for them? And the outcomes for Dermot and Julie, as you saw this morning, they weren't by accident. They were the outcomes of a determined and very focused family in doing what is, as Catherine called it, inclusion, and ensuring inclusion and ensuring fulfillment of potential. So as I talk to you today, then I wondered what perhaps reflections I could give you over the space of a short piece such as this morning. And I'm conscious I'm talking to you as a group of social work professionals, and of course there are many other disciplines who have an active interest in this subject matter. And I guess one of the things I wanted to reflect on for a couple of minutes is systems and structures. And why do I want to do that? Well, I want to do it because you will see that very quickly it will lead me on to a place of talking about what I believe is being attempted, needs to continue to be attempted, and to use Niall Muldoon's phrase, needs to be not cast in perfection, but cast in continuous improvement. And that I'm talking about is integration. I come from a background where I can remember the structures of Ireland's health and personal social services going back quite a significant period of time, over 30 years. And even if you go back a little bit before my time into what were the former health boards in Ireland, I can recall a system where life appeared simple, structures appeared simple, so structures appeared easy to understand. That's not to say they always achieved everything they wanted to achieve, or indeed it's not to say that they should have stayed the way they were. But there was a time in Ireland when the health board system had three simple parts to it. It had the local regional hospital, which was the acute hospital. It had the special hospitals, which were the elderly care and the mental health institutions as they were then. And it had community care, which was essentially the local area medical officer, the public health nurse, the community welfare officer, and latterly, but sometime latterly, the social worker. You'd be hard pressed in the 1980s in the health service to find a physiotherapist outside of a hospital or a special hospital. And now there are an explosion of all allied health professionals and social work services right across a whole range of community services. And that shows how services have changed and how evidence has changed and how styles and classes of intervention have changed. I was listening to Jude there from the Lindara service, and I can recall as a young health service employee in the Midwest, I can recall there never being a CAMS service, and I can recall the very first CAMS consultant being appointed there. Now I think when I left there, I think there are 6, if not 7. All with multidisciplinary teams around them, and those are really good advances. And but the point about structures was very quickly after those 3 programs, what happened was we developed in Ireland's system what we call a care group model. And so we have a disability care group, we have a mental health care group, we have a primary care group, we have a social inclusion care group, and we had a children and families care group. And those are really good things because they brought about them very specific focus on those specific needs. they brought about advocacy, they brought about new legislation, they brought about regulations, and they brought about many different things. But the reason I want to talk about structures, and I want to talk about those care group structures, is they also brought and bring their own challenges. And that's not to say they shouldn't happen. Structures are important. They're important for governance and other things. But they did bring many challenges. And one of the greatest challenges, I believe, that structures bring is the challenge of integration. If I could ask you to cast your minds back just to 2014, when the Child and Family Agency was established, it was established as an extraction from the HSE on the belief and on the basis that establishing a dedicated, single and focused agency on the care group of children and families would bring about a resolution to all of what were seen to be the many problems, challenges and indeed scandals that characterised the discourse on child protection services over particularly the latter part of the 1990s and into the noughties. And there is no doubt that the establishment of the agency did allow for and bring a very welcome focus, and perhaps its greatest achievement was to take that fear that child protection and welfare services would be lost in this melee of a health system that increasingly became focused on a hospital-centric model, because that's what people focused on. That's what the public focused on. And so it did bring a benefit, but did it bring many challenges? Yes, it did. Did it resolve things? Yes, it did. But it brought even greater integration challenges. And so let me give you two reflections on that. As part of one of my many roles as a senior manager in the health services, before TUSLA was established, I managed and line managed the different care groups. So the disability manager in Limerick, the child and family manager in Limerick, the mental health manager in Limerick, the older persons manager in Limerick, they all reported or pointed into my office. Were there challenges and disputes about cases then? Were there challenges and disputes about who owned the case, who was the lead, who took the most responsibility, who provided indeed the resource if resource was required? All of those debates happened within the one organisation, but between the different parts of the structure of that organisation. And those same debates happened in the case of Molly, and those same debates happened between what is now the HSE and the Child and Family Agency. So with our structures and with the importance of structures comes that challenge of integration. And so what I would say is that the care group system, regardless of which group we are talking about or which need we are talking about, we could say the exact same in relation to CAMS, or indeed adults with mental health services, or indeed older people with chronic disease. As we develop expertise in each individual subject matter and care group, and as we subspecialise and subspecialise further, and you guys work in the disability services and you know that there was one time occupational therapists. There are now occupational therapists who specialise in disability, and there are indeed occupational therapists who specialise in subsets of disability. And rightly so. Expertise science is a really good thing. But it's because we develop those structures, those systems and those specialities that we all have to be mindful, and we have to be challenged every day by reaching that higher bar, and very often what appears to be the elusive integration. And if we pursue integration, well, what does that mean in practical terms? I think there are a lot of different things we could say about it. And writing in the Irish health context, I know that one particular author looking at the health service, and when I say health service, I mean all of the social care services as well. But in writing about integration in the context of the Irish health service, this particular writer, Darker is her name, was able to identify in the international literature 175 different definitions of integration, because everyone has a view on it, everyone has a perspective, everyone has a take. And why? Because it is of itself not an exact science. It is as much an aspiration, it is a way of working, it's a belief system, it's a value, it's a culture, as well as methodology. And yet, when all was said and done in those 175 definitions, I guess it boils down to the World Health Organization and other definitions, but it really boils down to two things for me. Integration, true integration in services, whether they are personal social services, whether they're health services, whether they're alternative care services, whether they're education services, whether they're justice services, whether they're equality services. But in any service that a person interacts with, needs, uses, wants, has to have, integration is when people get what they need, when they need it, and for the right outcome. That ultimately captures what integration is, and therefore should be the challenge to all of us. And the second thing I would say about integration is integration isn't of itself an end. It's not an object. It's not an objective that I should think I will get my organization by 5 steps to. Integration is a means. It's a means. It's a means of understanding, and it's a means of working. And so if I take you back very briefly to the care groups that we talked about, really good, seminal, hard work done in those care groups, and should continue to be. But when I take you back to them, and I take you to the two care groups that I guess we're talking about really in the context of what I'm saying to you today, which is children and family services and disability services. There are children who are in the child protection, welfare and family support space who do not have a disability. There are children who have a disability who are not in the child protection, welfare and family support space. One might think that that's pretty straightforward. Well, it's not straightforward, because there still is within the child and family agency, as indeed within the health service, there's a requirement for integration within the different parts of those organisations to make sure the outcome is effective. However, when a child is in both the disability and the child protection, welfare or family support space, when they are together, the challenge of integration is very high. That's what Molly was about. That's what Molly is about. And indeed, the Ombudsman perhaps would reflect to you, Molly's an index case of that, or an indicator. There are others. And so the challenge of integration is so high. And perhaps, apart from all of the protocols, and we do have some very good and advanced protocols, I think we have made improvements this year. But it's not my job to blow trumpet about what those improvements are. I think we have removed, for example, when a child with a disability, also with a child welfare issue, when a child is the subject of the joint protocol, we have now just probably in this week about to be signed off, but we have now arrived at an agreement where if that child has to come into an alternative care system, be it a disability specialist placement or a child protection placement, but where both agencies are justifiably involved because of the protocol, we have now taken away from the professionals the need to argue about who pays or who doesn't pay. And that's a very significant step forward. Ironically, where the child doesn't have to come into care is probably where still some of the greatest challenges are, because children at perhaps with mild disability, but who still nonetheless need services, those services are in the primary care space. And I think everybody knows that those services are very challenged. They're exceptionally challenged in terms of waiting lists. And so I believe part of the answer of that, of course, is positive discrimination in favour of the most needy at times. But whatever the reference points are, whether it's disability, child protection or both, And Conor mentioned earlier the legal framework, and I find when I read cases that the agency is involved in before the President of the High Court, I certainly find that we're in danger. We're in danger as public service organisations of presenting too many problems and not enough solutions, because of the boundaries that are drawn, either because of the legislation that gives us our function, the resource that gives us what we do, or the organisation setup that we have. And we can easily, in that context, lose sight of the fact that children don't live in care groups. Children don't live in agencies. Children are children, and children live lives. And when that life has a need, or when that potential in that life is challenged, if not indeed threatened, then the type of service and support system that's required for that is one that is truly integrated, so that it doesn't matter to the child or the family whether that's the HSE or whether that's TUSLA, or indeed whether that's the Department of Education. And that's what real integration is, and that's what we have to pursue. And that's why I think your point of focus today on one child explores many of those challenges, none of which come with easy answers, but the answers do and will become easier if all of our disposition as public services, if all of it is about focusing, is about focused on integration. So when I look here, I see, what is TUSLA's position when children are abandoned in hospitals because of stress and inability to continue managing at home? Okay, well, as somebody who managed hospital services in the past and now in the position that I'm in, I think it's very regrettable that situations emerge where children are in hospital for prolonged periods of time when they don't have a medical requirement to be there. So that's the first thing. I think that's exceptionally regrettable. The second thing I would say is, if, as I assume in the question, and I am perhaps making an assumption, if there's a prevalence of significant level of disability and or indeed adolescent mental health issues within it, that's where the integrated requirement comes in. Because that should not be a case where the disability services alone should be expected to or should find the solution, or the child and family agency alone, or indeed the CAM services, depending on the case. It should be the case that it is a collective response with a collective solution and a collective focus. And there will be times when the disability dimension that's driving the care will suggest that the disability service is a natural lead. And there will indeed be times when the care and protection and welfare side suggests that the TUSLA service should be the lead. But one being the lead doesn't obviate the other of their responsibility. Children are considered safe in an acute hospital, and the experience on the ground is that TUSLA feel it's a disability services issue, and disability services feel it's a TUSLA issue. I think that's what I've just said. As you say, true integration means that we have to somehow overcome the structural and budgetary barriers. Yes, we do. But they're not just structural and budgetary barriers. I firmly believe they're also within our own disposition as professionals. And why do I say that? What's my evidence for saying that? Well, like I said, before there was ever a child and family agency, I managed a health service where it was quite common for two different care groups to argue over actually whose case is it. And while that is driven by statutory responsibility, budgets and history and other things, it means we're not starting from the right place. We're not starting from the place, here is a child and this child has a requirement. I've rarely encountered children or indeed older people who have chronic disease. It's ironic, there's some of the similarities in both care groups. I've rarely encountered a child who requires intervention and support of public services but only requires one discipline or one part of the system. Rarely have I encountered that, and that's why integration is so important. What are your thoughts on children going into full-time residential placement through the disability service and who then in effect don't have the statutory protections that TUSLA Children's Day Care have. Yeah, well, that question is one that's often asked of me, and indeed the Ombudsman I know raised it in a case not yet published. What would I say to you about it? Well, the first thing I would say is the children who come into placement in disability services have at least the possibility of much more protection in the regulatory space than they did have heretofore, because under the Health Act 2007, leading to the disability placement of children in residential centres for disabilities 2013, there is quite a good regulatory standard and context there. Even if it's not being achieved, the oversight is there. One thing I would say, and I have argued this with the Ombudsman in a discussion recently, as I have done with my colleagues in the HSE, children coming into state care in the context of what we understand state care to be in terms of TUSLA, or the Child and Family Agency, or the legislative framework that Conor talked about. Children coming into state care are coming predominantly because that link between Section 3 and the other parts of the Act, adequate care and protection where they are, and indeed, in many cases, unfortunately, being abused, mistreated, or neglected. I do not believe that children who have a disability, who are in loving, caring homes with families who do nothing other than give of their all to care for and support them, I do not believe in that context that when the level of care for the disability becomes so high that the default position should be the child protection legislation. In other words, I don't believe we should be funneling children into something for which it wasn't designed. I'm very satisfied there's adequate provisions in the Health Act and in the subsequent regulations to provide those services. But I equally would say where both cross over each other, the integration is the critical piece. Last question. With the review of the Child Care Act, I'd be interested to know what your view is on the use of voluntary admissions to care being so varied across the country, but for children with disability in long-term care, and of course all children in long-term care, do you feel it's appropriate to children's permanency planning that they remain in care on voluntary consent? Wow. Well, that is a debate that's quite significant at the moment. There's a lot of recent research, particularly Conor O'Mahony, who happens to also be the Special Rapporteur on children around voluntary consent. I'm not going to make the distinction between disability and indeed child protection in responding to that. What I would say to you is voluntary consent to alternative care has always been a really important feature of the relationship between the state and families, because it creates a space where there can be full agreement about the need for care at a point in time and the shared understanding of it. However, in the context of the modern day world we've moved on to, and levels of regulation, oversight, scrutiny, and indeed learnings from when things go wrong, I would say without fear of contradiction that voluntary care needs a lot more checks and balances to make sure it's not something that drifts, or indeed that it's never used inappropriately, and as you rightly say, significant questions arise in the context of permanency planning. So I think that's all the questions, I think. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. That was really, really interesting speak. And I actually got a quick email from our colleagues who are managing the questions, who said, just want to acknowledge everyone who's provided us with questions. Unfortunately, we haven't got to every one of them, but they've all been very valid, just to know that we are recognising that we're not getting to everyone's question. Just as we're short on time, I'm going to pop us on to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Caroline Canton. Caroline is a social worker by profession. She's worked in Naval Ireland and Tallaght for over 20 years and is the National Programme Coordinator for the Progressive Disability Service for Children and Young People. Her talk today will focus on 3 relevant joint working protocols that the HSE and TUSLA, the internal HSE protocol capturing primary care disability and CAMS, and also the protocol with AIM. So I'll pass it on to her now, please.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and hello everyone. Delighted to join you, and it's been really interesting the day so far. All right, so as Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about the joint working protocols. My first slide there about collaboration, integration, etc. I don't think I need to go over that again. I think it's been really well covered by Bernard just now and by others earlier today. So I think we're all on the same page there. So the 3 joint working protocols that I'm going to talk about are putting on the structure, getting the right skeleton, if you like, there for us to work far more closely together. So those 3 protocols are what I'll be going through. Just to note that wherever health services are mentioned, or even the HSE is mentioned, they all refer to and completely include all funded agencies, both in the HSE, the Section 38s and Section 39s, and the funded agency that TUSLA has. So don't be thinking that they've been ignored. Okay, so I completely sympathise with this view. These protocols don't really make for light reading, not the sort of thing you'd be picking up very readily. However, what I want to do today is really emphasise how useful they can be to sort of promote those structures, especially between divisions that Bern has just talked about and between agencies. I'm hoping to give you some key points in those very quickly in this short presentation, just to sort of give you, sort of highlight things for you in the 3 protocols. Also to say that each of them has flowcharts, which can be very helpful to sort of give you a summary and give you an idea of what you're supposed to do and how you're to proceed. So firstly, this joint working protocol between primary care, disability and CAMS. And again, we've heard about the needs. I don't need to go on too much about the children's needs crossing services, children with disability, children with intellectual disabilities, we've just heard, who have a fairly high risk of mental health issues as well, and how we need to work together on those. I was on the working group for this particular protocol, and we heard really distressing stories about referrals going back from one service to another. And a lot of the time you feel that criteria for access to services is more about excluding than including. And I can completely understand. I was there putting up fences to protect your service. We've all got finite resources, and we're trying to provide the very best service we can for the children receiving those services. And we tend to put up those barriers to control the huge demand on our services. But so we put up the fences, and if I don't get too carried away with the metaphor, I think we need to make sure we've got gates in those fences that we can talk across, or maybe even lower the fences so that we can communicate across the different services and not just build up these silos. And as Niall said much earlier, we need that flexibility to look at children's individual needs. So the recommendations from this protocol are, not surprisingly, much higher degree of collaboration. We need seamless access to services so that children can access, again, back to Sláinte Care's slogan, right care, right time, right place. We need information available for referrers and for parents and families on where to access services and how to do that. We need a much greater, much more fluid consultation between services, that people can lift the phone and get a consult. For instance, again, a child attending a Children's Disability Network team, if there's a mental health issue, to be able to lift the phone and talk to a counterpart or somebody in CAMS or CAMS ID on an informal basis, as well as proceeding to maybe a more formal consultation. So we need that joint working, which includes joint assessment where it's needed, joint intervention. I was also on a group that was looking at services for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. And again, we had lots of distressing examples of children for years not getting the right assessment. Children who maybe had, who were deaf, but also had behavioural difficulties as an example, and no one service being able to provide the right assessment for that child. They need to work together. You may need psychiatry working with the disability staff to do that joint assessment. And a very key recommendation from this protocol, very dear to my heart, is setting up the Integrated Children's Services Forum, which I'll be talking about in a second. Firstly, just to look at this, here's one of the flowcharts, or I've rather simplified it on this slide, but there are full flowcharts in this protocol. So if you look there, a child has different kinds of difficulties. So the referral goes in those blue boxes, either to primary care or to the Children's Disability Network team if that child has a disability and complex needs, or if they have a moderate severe mental health disorder, to CAMS. And obviously the people in those services look at that referral, study all the information they're given, and make a decision one of three ways. So in the pink boxes, if this is the appropriate service, great, away we go. Child moves onwards to get their assessment and any interventions they require. If a service is clearly, it's another service that would be more appropriate, this has come to the wrong place. So therefore, the receiver of the referral, that receiving service, redirects that referral. It may be that it has to go back to the referrer, but they inform the family, or they get permission to actually directly send it on to the other service. If there's difficulties arising out of that, they can refer that referral on to be discussed at the Integrated Children's Services Forum. The third alternative is, from this referral information, you can see there's more than one service is required for this child. So again, discuss with that service how you can do joint working, but if necessary, again, refer it on to the Integrated Children's Services Forum for discussion and decision. And that's where we are now. Here's the forum. So this is the forum which now makes final decisions, which means there's an end to the to and fro of referrals going from one service to another and never managing to land. This is a forum with senior managers advised and bringing in frontline clinicians as they require. And it is led by primary care, disability services, the Children's Disability Network team, and by CAMS. So they lead this forum. They will be always at this table, and then they will bring in others as are needed according to the child that's actually going to be discussed that day. So it may be education, maybe the school needs to be involved, or it may be TUSLA, or it could be the acute hospital, whoever is needed to be in there. And really the whole point of this is to get people around a table. And as you will all know, if you get people usually around a table discussing it, everybody has the child's interests at the center. And that's why you can form those decisions with the child's best interests. And we do have, it's taking a little time, but we do have some integrated children's services committees around the country in the HSE, and they're looking at actually setting up these ICSFs, and they should be in every local area in the future. Okay, moving on now. So this is the joint protocol that has been referred to a couple of times today between TUSLA and the health services. And Bernard's obviously talked quite a bit about this. And it did arise, well, I think it actually was 2017, so it was around the same time as the Molly report. So already recognised we've got issues here, but the Molly report obviously focused minds even more on what we need to do. So obviously the focus here is children and young people whose needs cross health services and TUSLA, and there's the various issues we've already heard about. Now, I was glad to hear from Bernard that the issue around funding is getting sorted, that, you know, professionals on the front line, as it were, don't have to have that concern about who's going to foot the bill for whatever is required. We need that sorted. One of the key recommendations out of this protocol is the need for really good transition planning for young people who are maybe in care now and have disability or mental health needs. And that needs to start really early. In the report, it says from their 16th birthday. We need to involve that young person very much, as Catherine was saying earlier, hear their voice, hear their views. It's their lives. They have a right to decide on how they want to live their life. And we need to support them to do that. But we should be all getting around the table again at an early stage, not, you know, shortly before they're going to leave care at the age of 18. So that's another very important part in this protocol. These are the flow chart, the pathways. So if there's a concern raised by health services or TUSLA, obviously we have the recognised pathways to a MEHL or interagencies approach to notifying TUSLA under Children First, and then to the local aftercare steering committees. Again, as I said, on their 16th birthday, they should start looking at what children's needs are and should be involving health professionals in those discussions and those decisions. So the protocol is advocating for joint working at local level. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Any unresolved issues, hopefully not too many, can be escalated to an area joint working group. And again, they're joint, but as between the health services and TUSLA. And those are now set up in all parts of the country. Then again, hopefully not too many issues will not be resolved there, but there is a path for escalation. In other words, it doesn't have to get stuck at a certain point without being resolved. It goes upwards. So just that joint working at local level, what's recommended in the protocol is very early engagement. Early warning signs, early warning systems, I think are mentioned. Get talking early, have informal consultation between services, flag issues that you can see are going to come up. Maybe, for instance, when a young person's going to be leaving care and they'll have ongoing needs. But younger children as well, as Niall said earlier, you're probably going to have a fair idea on some of the needs the child has from very early on in their life. You don't have to wait until they start to really become clear. Any professional could then, if they still need more work to support a child or young person, they can call an interagency meeting. And at that meeting, they can develop a joint care plan. And those are that's the kind of outline of what you should be doing, agreeing who's the lead agency for this child and this family, and which professional is going to be the key coordinator for that. Identify the interventions wherever those need to come from, across the health services, TUSLA, etc., whoever you need to involve. And again, if you can see that a need cannot be met, and we all know that there are those, and again, finite resources, advise line management. This is going to be an issue. We need to have this resolved. And the area joint working group can step in there as well. So that's a very quick flyby of the the TUSLA HSE joint working protocol. So the last one I'm going to talk about briefly is the AIM joint working protocol, which actually I think, I don't have the full title there, but I can tell you it probably has the record for the longest title of any document. However, we will call it the AIM joint working protocol. So I'm sure, well, those of you certainly who work with children will be very familiar with the access and inclusion model of supports for children with disability in preschool. And the whole focus of AIM is to maximise the child's participation in preschool. and it has the 7 levels. The first 3 of those are universal for all children in preschool, for all information for parents and for preschool providers, and then supports in terms of training for the workforce, for preschool staff. So this protocol is about the next 4 levels, 4 to 7, which are the targeted supports. Right, so level 4 is expert educational advice, and this is the role of the early years specialists who will be providing that direct support to preschools. They need to build up a strong relationship between with the health services, particularly the Children's Disability Network teams, but also primary care. And if the child is known to a health service, if the EYS feels they need a bit of support, maybe they're not feeling the child is still, despite all their help, is not participating as well as they could, they should contact that health professional to review what strategies are being used and to get suggestions of what else could be done. If the child is not known to a health service, they can contact them again to seek, without knowing obviously the details of the child, the health service won't know those, can seek appropriate universal strategies to use. They can also refer, obviously all of this with parental consent, can refer to a team, a children's disability team or a primary care service if they feel that's needed to support that child. So the next level is level 5, which is about equipment and minor capital alterations to preschools. So again, a lot of this is the preschool and the parents will make an application for funding for these. The health professional's role then is to confirm with the EYS that it is this equipment or this particular adaptation is critical to this child's participation in preschool. They may feel that they need to be present for the setup of, if there's a particular piece of equipment and a physio or the OT is needed, for instance, they may advise that they should be there to actually set up that piece of equipment and to provide the preschool staff with any training that's necessary. They can also provide advice on equipment which may be transferred with the child from preschool to school, which obviously makes a lot of sense. Level 6 is health service support. So this is where the health service really comes in to support the EYS and the preschool. There are 2 levels here. Again, universal, giving more information and advice to the EYS on the children's particular needs. But then there's the level of targeted support where an individual child requires intervention and support plans, and the health professionals can work closely again with the preschool staff and with the EYS to provide that support. Finally, the level 7 is additional capitation, and this is usually where the preschool feels that they need the monies to be able to employ an additional adult in the preschool, which would lower the child to staff ratio and therefore help them support the child with the disability. This is the role of the EYS to recommend whether this is required. And it is not actually the role of the health services to get involved in that application, except to provide copies where they have pre-existing reports. So they shouldn't be asked to provide more reports. They shouldn't be asked to provide letters. But they can, obviously, if it would be helpful, provide any information they already have. Okay, so finally, where can you find these protocols? You can find them under key national documents in the PDS pages, the Progressing Disability Services for Children and Young People pages, which is obviously my main job here, but I haven't talked about PDS today. But you will find a lot of information on that website, so do visit it anyway. And then there's the direct link there. And as I understand from Claire and Sarah, you will get access to these presentations, so you don't have to hastily try and copy that down now. You'll be able to use that link. So just to say, to finish up, we need to realize these protocols. We need to set up our integrated children's services forums, etc., and really use them to help us to bring about greater integration. Okay. Oh, goodness. First question here. Would Caroline please comment on the fact that there are no social workers on many primary care teams? Very interesting. I do know of some colleagues in primary care, but I know it's relatively new, and I suppose I wouldn't want to comment too much because I wouldn't be that familiar with primary care. My history has all been in disability services. I would agree, why would I not, that there should be social workers on primary care teams, and they have a huge role. One particular one I knew when I was working in the Dublin Southwest area was excellent, all the work she was doing, which was brilliant. Transition is so important, yet HSE funding allocation is so late each year. Please note no transport for school leavers, where some young people have been availing of transport for, in some cases, over 14 years. Absolutely, I'd agree. And every year, there's colleagues of mine in the national disability offices working on school leavers and getting that funding. And I couldn't agree more. We need to get that. Just as we're saying, transition should be planned a couple of years in advance. We need that funding to come much earlier, and for people to feel secure in that. Can you comment on the key role social work plays in the process of integration of systems and the growing reliance on assessment and clinical treatments that are more focused on treating the specific problem at hand? Well, you come to the right person with that. I would absolutely agree. I have heard people call social workers on the Children's Disability Network team as the oil to grease the wheels. I know we've already heard oils, communication is the oil of collaboration, but it's also oil within a team to make it go. I've also heard it described as social work as the jam in the sandwich, so maybe that's even more fundamental. Absolutely. I think social workers are so well placed to really see outside, to see the full picture, to really look at all the needs of the family and the child and see all those other factors. Why something, I think Catherine was it, talking about, if things aren't going well, there could be lots of other things going on for that family, and social workers are an absolute key point of observing that. We will hope, just to verge a bit into my PDS role, the ambition would be certainly to have social workers on every team, along with all the other professionals we need. And we are at the model. The PDS model is interdisciplinary teams, and therefore everybody working really closely together as a team. Is that the last question? Okay, thank you very much. Righto.
Welcome back, everybody. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Caroline, for all the protocols you went through there. Very interesting and really good for us to know. We have slightly run over. I see it's 12:38. We were due to finish at 12:30. So Sarah and I will do a very quick run through of what we covered today and try and let you guys go in the next few minutes. Just, I guess, to quickly look at the poll first. So thank you all for engaging in that. The idea behind it obviously was that we wanted to hear from everyone attending today on your thoughts on what work is like for you on the ground. So just to quickly run through that, just to note that there are 79% of the people on today are in fact social workers. And then the others are spread across the board. 3% managers in human services, 6% voluntary service, 1% community service, 10% allied health professionals, and 12% other. What struck me with the rest of the information that came forward, does effective collaborative work happen in your work? This was hugely positive. 1% said no, and all of the rest were yes most of the time or some of the time, which is fantastic. This work is already happening. And it's great that we're all here today to talk about it, the importance of effective collaborative work and getting that message out there across disciplines with family support services and so on. And then on a scale of 1 to 5, how child-centred is the practice where you work? Again, almost 50% of people, 49%, had marked that as a 4. which is fantastic. So really there's a lot of child-centred work going on. And finally, which leads me to my last piece then, looking at how we can support collaborative work going forward. 71%, so the vast majority had said regular joint meetings between all stakeholders is what you guys feel would be the best. And this is kind of tying it all together, looking at the fact that we are, people are very social, you know, from the human perspective. That support system that can be in place. People want the support, the element of teamwork, collaborative work, and using communication. So 71% is far more than looking at the other side. 3% ask for better technology, and the others are spread out across that. So really just to acknowledge that as social beings, this is how we can make change, to work collaboratively in partnership with families, with support services, with the agencies around us, and using the communication. I was really drawn by Catherine's talk earlier about what she was saying about the importance of communication, and communicating not just among ourselves as professionals, but also with families, and the ability to really actively listen. And as social workers, we'll all recall how important that was in college, learning about the active listening, and just to sit and be with families, with children. And I liked how Catherine was saying, you know, talk to the child, what do they want? So really to actively listen and use our social work skills and use our communication skills with our colleagues, with families, to create better outcomes for children. I think that's really rang through very clearly through all the speakers today, which is fantastic. And it's come through also with the poll. I'm going to just pass you on briefly to Sarah, and then I'll finish up, and then we're done for the day. Thank you.
Yeah, Claire, I think it was all very relevant, and I want to thank all the speakers. It was really fantastic, real food for thought, I thought. The bit I kind of came through for me, and it kind of you named there, Claire, as well, in the poll, the 49% about the child-centred practice, that they feel it's happening. And I think, you know, Catherine, Bernard, and Niall kind of named that today. And I think it's so important that you know, that we are always reminded there's a child in the middle of this, that when we're working collaboratively or through agencies, or working within those systems and structures that they talked about, that there is a child there. I think that's really, really important. And the line that kind of stuck out for me is, and Catherine and Bernard kind of both named this today, was a child needs to get what they need when they need it to ensure better outcomes. And I think how to do that was kind of, you know, where everyone else spoke about was the flexibility in our practice, and the overlapping of professions, and not getting kind of stuck in our structures and in our systems. And that all goes back to then that child being in the centre of it. And I just thought it was something that really struck me, and it's great to hear it's happening. And as Caroline kind of showed us there is the protocols there to enable us to do that. And, you know, as in teams within different kind of care groups or social care systems. So it was just something that kind of came from me today.
Thanks, Sarah. Just to quickly name then as well, we want to say a huge thank you to our 6 fantastic speakers today. I'm sure you got a lot of information from each of them and found it quite enjoyable. I know I definitely did. They've come with a wealth of knowledge and experience that we're truly grateful for. Also to say thank you so much to the ICW for allowing us to run this event today. That's Cleena, Marina, Anya and Danielle. Thank you to them. And also to SWID, a big thank you, particularly to the subgroup who I'd mentioned earlier, and absolutely to Stream Tech in the background. This ties in with what we've learned from today about the importance of good communication. We have them in our ears, and all the speakers you would have seen did also, and working the screens for us, which has made life a hell of a lot easier. Just to briefly mention, we are happy to take on members at all times in the SWID group, and the RCW are the same. You'll find more information on the RCW website if you want to join them, or just to get some information about upcoming events or the work that they do. SWID meet generally every month virtually. Our next meeting is Friday the 6th of November at 10:30 via Zoom. So if you'd like more information on that, you will see our secretary Anna Loughlin, her contact details there below. You can send her an email if you'd like to join us. Finally, thank you to everyone. Thank you all for attending, taking part in the poll, and for all your fantastic questions. Apologies if we didn't get to them all. I'm sure you'll appreciate was a lot that came through, and we wanted to make sure that we ended the day on a close-ish to 12:30. Thank you everyone, and keep safe, mind yourselves, and have a lovely weekend.